She had spent 34 years being told she was too much, too heavy, too soft, too desperate to be loved. Today, standing at the altar in a cathedral that cost more than most people earned in a lifetime, Evelyn Whitmore finally believed the cruelty was behind her. She believed the man holding her hands meant every word he had ever whispered. She was wrong. What happened next inside that cathedral would be broadcast across every screen in New York by nightfall, not as a love story, but as the most calculated public destruction one man had ever staged. If you've ever been betrayed by someone you trusted completely, stay with me until the very end. Hit that like button and drop your city in the comments. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. The morning arrived the way important mornings always did. Without ceremony, without warning, just gray light pushing through the curtains of the bridal suite on the 14th floor of the Whitmore family's private hotel on Fifth Avenue. Evelyn sat at the vanity and looked at herself for a long time without moving. She wasn't doing her hair, she wasn't touching the makeup brushes laid out in perfect rows by the stylist who had arrived at 5 in the morning. She was just looking. The woman in the mirror was 34 years old. Thick arms, round face, a body that had spent 3 decades being discussed by people who had no right to discuss it. At dinner tables, in boardrooms, in the half-whispered conversations she was always meant to overhear. Her father's friends, her college roommates, the photographers who shot charity galas and somehow always managed to frame her just slightly worse than everyone else standing beside her. She had learned not to flinch. That was what people called progress. "You're not ready." Madison Harper pushed through the door without knocking, the way she had been pushing through Evelyn's doors since they were 11 years old and sharing a desk in the 5th grade. She was wearing the dusty rose bridesmaid gown and carrying a champagne flute, and the sight of her, all 5'6" of deliberate elegance, hit Evelyn with a familiar, complicated warmth. 23 years of friendship. Sleepovers and broken hearts and midnight phone calls. Madison had held her hand through her mother's funeral, had sat on the bathroom floor of a Paris hotel when a man Evelyn thought she loved had left without saying goodbye. "I'm thinking," Evelyn said. "You can think after you're married." Madison set the champagne down on the vanity and picked up a blush brush. "Open your eyes wider." "I'm serious, Maddie." "So am I." "Blink." Evelyn blinked. She watched Madison work with the calm efficiency of someone who had done this 1,000 times. Watched those practiced hands smooth color along her cheekbones with something that looked exactly like affection. "Do you think he actually loves me?" Evelyn asked. The brush paused for half a second, so brief that if Evelyn hadn't been watching the mirror, she would have missed it. "Of course he does," Madison said. "Don't do this today." "I'm not doing anything. I'm asking." "You're spiraling." Madison stepped back and tilted her head, studying her work. "You look beautiful." Evelyn looked at her own reflection. The dress was ivory silk, custom fitted by a designer who had spent 6 weeks adjusting panels and seams without once making her feel like a problem to be solved. It was the most expensive thing she had ever worn. Nathan had paid for it without blinking, had called her when the final fitting photos arrived and said, his voice low and certain, that he was the luckiest man in New York. She had believed him. She still wanted to believe him. Nathan Caldwell had arrived in her life 16 months ago at a rooftop reception for the Hargrove Foundation, standing near the bar with the easy confidence of someone who had never spent a single day of his life wondering whether he deserved to be in the room. He was 41, handsome in a sharp-jawed way, the kind of man who walked into spaces and made other men readjust their posture. He ran Caldwell Capital Real Estate, a firm with offices in 4 cities and a reputation for turning struggling properties into impossibly profitable developments. He had walked straight to Evelyn and said, without preamble, "I've been watching you work this room for the last 20 minutes. You're the only person here actually listening when other people talk." No one had ever led with that. They had dinner 3 days later, then again the following week. By the 2nd month, he was calling her every morning before she got out of bed and staying on the phone while she made coffee, not because either of them had something urgent to say, but because he said the sound of her voice made the day feel less transactional. She knew what people said. She'd heard it through the careful silences of her assistant and the overly bright smiles of her father's associates. A man like Nathan Caldwell, pursuing a woman like Evelyn Whitmore. The math seemed obvious to everyone except her. But Nathan had never once made her feel like arithmetic. He had held her hand in public, had pulled her close in rooms full of people who she knew were watching, had spent an entire Sunday afternoon on the floor of her apartment helping her sort through her mother's old photographs, handling each one with the kind of attention that couldn't be faked. Or so she thought. She picked up her champagne and finished it in one swallow. Madison raised an eyebrow but said nothing. "Let's go," Evelyn said. The cathedral on West 57th Street was a monument to a different century's idea of importance. Stone arches, vaulted ceilings, stained glass that threw colored light across the floor in thick columns. The Whitmore family had rented it for the afternoon at a cost that Evelyn refused to think about. Her father had insisted. William Whitmore believed that the size of a celebration announced the seriousness of the intention behind it, and he had wanted New York to understand that his daughter's wedding was serious. 500 guests. Every major name in technology, finance, media, and real estate. People who had known Evelyn since she was a child running between the legs of her father's business partners at Christmas parties. People who had watched her grow up and take her place at the head of Whitmore Technology's board of directors at 29. People who had admired her at a careful distance and occasionally said things behind her back that they would have denied to her face. They were all there. The car brought Evelyn and her father to the side entrance at 2:45. William Whitmore was 71 years old and moved like a man who had survived enough to stop being impressed by most things. But when he looked at his daughter in the ivory dress, something shifted in his face that he didn't bother to hide. "Your mother would have said something perfect right now," he said. "She would have told me to stand up straight and stop apologizing with my posture." William almost smiled. He offered his arm. She took it. They waited in the corridor while the music shifted inside, while 500 people rose to their feet, while the light under the heavy wooden doors turned golden and expectant. Evelyn felt her heartbeat in her throat. She gripped her bouquet, white peonies and trailing greenery, unpretentious because she had refused to let the florist make it architectural, and told herself this was what happiness felt like when it was real. Slightly terrifying. Slightly too large for the body containing it. The doors opened. The aisle stretched in front of her like something out of a dream she had stopped letting herself have by the time she was 20, and at the end of it, Nathan Caldwell stood in a charcoal suit with his hands clasped in front of him, watching her come toward him. She watched his face for the thing she always looked for. The involuntary softening, the unguarded moment before the social mask locked back into place. She had learned to read it over 16 months of watching him carefully, the way cautious people always watch the things they couldn't quite bring themselves to trust completely. She didn't see it. She told herself she was nervous, that the light was strange, that she was reading shadows where there were none. Nathan reached out and took her hand when she reached the altar, and his grip was firm and dry and certain, and she exhaled. The officiant began. The words moved through the cathedral in the formal sequence she had heard at a dozen weddings in the last decade, and Evelyn stood inside the sound of them and let herself be present. Let herself believe that the man holding her hand was exactly who he had spent 16 months convincing her he was. She was good at this, at choosing to trust, even when the choosing cost her something. Her father called it her greatest quality. Her therapist had spent 2 years gently suggesting it might also be her most dangerous one. Nathan released her hand. She almost didn't register it as strange. People shifted during ceremonies. They adjusted their weight, touched their collar, turned to smile at a family member in the front row. But Nathan didn't do any of those things. He stepped back half a pace. He reached into his jacket and removed something that took Evelyn a full 3 seconds to identify because her mind refused to process it correctly. A wireless microphone. The officiant stopped speaking. The sound technician at the back of the cathedral looked confused for exactly the length of time it took Nathan to locate the frequency and tap it once. The sound cut through the cathedral and bounced off the stone arches. The guests stirred. Someone in the third row said something quiet and alarmed, and the person beside them shushed them. Nathan smiled. It was not the smile Evelyn knew. It was not the smile from the rooftop bar, or the Sunday afternoon on her apartment floor, or the morning he called to tell her the fitting photos had arrived. It was older and colder and more comfortable than any of those smiles, like a face he had been resting underneath the other one, waiting for exactly this moment to put on. "I owe everyone here an honest moment," he said. His voice was smooth, conversational, the voice of someone who had rehearsed this and enjoyed rehearsing it. "Evelyn and I have been very public about this relationship. She has been very generous with her trust, and I think, before we go any further, this audience deserves to know exactly what kind of investment they've been watching." The air in the cathedral changed. Evelyn felt it against her skin before she understood it. That particular silence that descends when a room full of sophisticated people realizes simultaneously that something has gone catastrophically wrong and no one has yet determined how to respond. "Nathan," her voice came out smaller than she intended. "What are you doing?" "What I should have done 2 months ago," he said, still smiling, "saving us both some time." He turned to face the guests, and he began. Evelyn stood and listened to her own life being disassembled in front of 500 people. Nathan described the relationship with the detached precision of a man explaining a business model, entry point, strategy, projected returns. He had identified Evelyn Whitmore at a technology conference 14 months before the rooftop party, he explained, as the most accessible route into Whitmore Technology's board structure. William Whitmore's health had been declining. Evelyn's position was powerful, but emotionally exposed. A strategic partnership through marriage would give Caldwell Capital influence over the company's real estate assets, which Nathan intended to leverage against 3 pending commercial developments worth a combined $400 million. He said the word leverage with the same inflection most people reserved for words like home or future. "Every date," Nathan said, "every phone call, every Sunday afternoon." He paused and looked directly at Evelyn. "You were a very willing subject. I'll give you that." Someone in the audience gasped. Someone else didn't bother to hide a short, horrified laugh before swallowing it. Evelyn's hands had stopped working. The bouquet hit the floor. She didn't notice. She was looking at Nathan's face and understanding, with the particular violence of complete clarity, that she had never actually seen it before. Not once in 16 months. What she had seen was a performance assembled specifically for her, calibrated to her history, her insecurities, her specific hunger to be chosen without conditions. "I should also mention," Nathan continued, his voice warming with something that might have been genuine amusement if it hadn't been so deliberate, "that the physical component of this arrangement required some creative motivation." He let that sentence breathe for a moment. "Evelyn is a remarkable woman in many ways, but let's be honest with each other. There are accommodations a man makes when the returns justify the expense." The silence after that sentence was absolute. And then, from the third row on the left side of the cathedral, came the sound of a phone camera clicking. Evelyn turned toward it without meaning to, the way you turn toward any unexpected sound when your nervous system had already abandoned coherent reasoning. Madison Harper was standing at her seat. Her dusty rose bridesmaid gown caught the colored light from above. Her phone was raised, and she was not laughing exactly, but her mouth was curved in a way that required muscle control, in a way that didn't happen by accident. The floor moved. Not literally, but the sensation was identical. 23 years of friendship, the Paris hotel bathroom, the photograph sorting on a Sunday afternoon that Madison had also been present for, that Madison had suggested as an activity, that Madison had organized with the particular thoughtfulness of someone who understood exactly which gestures landed hardest. Evelyn turned back to Nathan. He was watching her process it. He seemed to find that part interesting. She turned and walked. The ivory dress was long and the train was substantial, and she was 3 steps toward the side aisle when she felt the resistance. Sudden, precise, absolute. She lurched. She caught the edge of the nearest pew with both hands and looked back and saw Nathan's foot planted on the trailing edge of her train. His weight settled into it with the calm certainty of someone who had planned this too. She pulled. The sound the dress made was not loud, but it carried. Silk under tension has a particular voice, and the cathedral's acoustics were designed to preserve every sound produced within them. The fabric gave along the left side seam first, then the back panel, and when it went completely, and the gasp that moved through 500 people was the loudest thing Evelyn had ever heard in her life. She was on her knees on the stone floor. The dress was in pieces around her. The cold of the stone came through what remained of the fabric immediately, and she pressed both palms flat against it and stared at the floor and tried to find a single coherent thought to hold on to. She found one. Get up. She was still pushing herself upright when the cathedral doors opened. Not the side door she had come through. The main doors, at the far end of the nave, directly behind the 500 guests who turned as one to see what had come in from the street. The man who walked through them was not tall in the theatrical way of men who knew they were being watched. He was simply present in a way that made the architecture feel slightly smaller. He wore a charcoal suit with no tie, and he moved with the particular economy of someone who had never needed to announce himself in any room he had ever entered, because every room already knew. Alexander Sterling. Evelyn watched 500 people who had spent their entire adult lives cultivating the ability to remain composed perform the same involuntary reaction. They went still. Senators, CEOs, hedge fund managers. Old money, new money, money so old it had stopped keeping track of itself. Every one of them adjusted something. Their expression, their posture, their grip on the person beside them. In the 3 seconds it took Alexander Sterling to reach the midpoint of the nave, he didn't stop to acknowledge any of them. He walked to the altar. He looked at Nathan Caldwell with the mild, interested attention of a man examining something he had already decided what to do with. Nathan's prepared confidence, the microphone still loose in his hand, the smile still technically present on his face, underwent a rapid, visible recalculation. Then Alexander turned away from Nathan, as if the recalculation didn't require his further attention, and he looked at Evelyn. She was still on her knees on the stone floor. She hadn't finished standing up. Her hands were pressed against the cold stone, and her dress was destroyed, and 500 people were looking at her, and she hadn't taken a breath in what felt like a very long time. Alexander removed his jacket. He lowered himself to one knee in front of her. Not with ceremony, not with performance, but with the directness of someone who understood that this particular moment required proximity and nothing else. And he settled the jacket across her shoulders with both hands. The fabric was warm from his body. It smelled like cedar and something she couldn't name. He looked at her. His eyes were gray and steady and completely without the things she had been seeing on every other face in the cathedral for the last 10 minutes. The complicated mixture of horror and satisfaction that gathered in people who were watching someone else's disaster from a safe distance. There was none of that. "Take your time," he said, quiet, just for her. She looked at his face and understood with the last functional piece of her reasoning mind that she did not know this man, that he had simply walked into the wreckage of her life and knelt down in it without being asked, that she had no framework for what this was or what it meant or what came next. He extended his hand. Evelyn looked at it for a moment, then she looked back at his face. "Who are you?" she asked. He held her gaze, and something moved behind his eyes. Not amusement, exactly. Something quieter and more complicated than that. "Someone who's been watching you long enough," he said, "to know that man's foot has been on your life, not just your dress, for the last 16 months. Evelyn felt her breath come back into her body all at once, sharp and painful, like the first breath after being underwater too long. Nathan's voice came from behind her, still carrying the microphone, recalibrating toward a new audience. "Sterling, this is a private ceremony. Whatever debt you think Caldwell Capital owes, sit down, Nathan." Alexander said it without turning around, without raising his voice. The way you said something to a person who had already stopped being relevant. Nathan Caldwell sat down. The cathedral was absolutely silent. Alexander's hand was still extended, steady, not wavering, not waiting with impatience or expectation, simply there, in the way of something that had decided to remain. Evelyn Whitmore looked at the hand of the most feared man in New York, and she felt, beneath the wreckage of the dress, beneath the cold of the stone floor, beneath the ruin of every story she had told herself about how her life was supposed to go, something she hadn't expected. She felt the very first edge of something that wasn't grief. She reached out and took his hand, and that was when Alexander Sterling looked up at Nathan Caldwell and said, with the quiet certainty of a man who had prepared for this specific moment for a very long time, "Before we go any further, I think it's time everyone in this room understood what this man actually came here to take." He reached into the interior pocket of the jacket now draped across Evelyn's shoulders, and he removed a sealed envelope, and the look on Nathan Caldwell's face in that instant, the first real expression the man had produced all day, was not anger. It was fear. Alexander didn't open the envelope immediately. He held it between two fingers, loose and unhurried, the way a man held something he had already decided the outcome of. The sealed edge caught the cathedral light. Thick paper, no markings on the outside, the kind of packaging that announced its own seriousness. 500 people watched it the way they might have watched a match held above a pool of gasoline. Nathan watched it differently. Nathan watched it the way a man watched something that had his name written on the inside. "That's," Nathan started. "Not yet," Alexander said. Still quiet. Still not looking at him. He helped Evelyn to her feet with the same economical attention he'd used to kneel beside her. No flourish, no theater, just a firm and steady pull until she was standing, his jacket still across her shoulders, her destroyed dress gathered around her in ivory ruins. She was upright now, but she wasn't steady. Her legs knew something her mind was still catching up to, some animal understanding that the ground she was standing on had permanently changed shape. Her father came off the front pew like a man 20 years younger. William Whitmore was not a physical man in the conventional sense. He was 71 years old and had spent the last 4 decades winning fights inside boardrooms and federal oversight hearings and hostile acquisition proceedings, not with his body, but with the particular controlled fury of someone who had learned exactly how much force to hold back and exactly when to release it. He crossed the distance between his pew and the altar in under 5 seconds, and put himself between Evelyn and Nathan with the blunt instinct of a man who had been standing between his daughter and damage her entire life, even when he'd failed to see the damage coming. He looked at Nathan. Nathan took 1 step back. "Don't," William said. "Just the word alone, stripped of everything except the weight behind it." Nathan's mouth opened, closed. William turned to Alexander. The two men looked at each other for a moment that had the texture of a conversation that had been happening for a very long time without either of them being in the same room for it. "Sterling," William said. "Mr. Whitmore." Alexander inclined his head slightly. "I apologize for the timing. Did you know before today?" It wasn't a question. The grammar of it was precise. No rising inflection, no space for equivocation. It was the kind of sentence that had already decided what answer it would accept. "Yes," Alexander said. William's jaw tightened. "Then why?" "Because she deserved to see it herself." Alexander glanced at Evelyn for exactly 1 second. Not to be told. Not to be protected from it in a back office somewhere while the problem got solved quietly. She deserved to see every person in that man's life look her in the face and show her exactly who they were. Evelyn was listening. She heard the logic of it. She understood the logic of it. The understanding sat next to something that felt like betrayal of its own particular variety. The knowledge that she had been watched, that her approaching disaster had been observed and allowed to develop rather than intercepted, that someone had made a decision about what she could and couldn't handle without once asking her. She filed that away. She didn't have the resources to open it right now. "The envelope," she said. Her voice came out level, steadier than she felt. Both men turned to her. "Show me what's in the envelope," she said. Alexander held it out to her. She took it from him without looking at his face, because she needed her hands to be doing something that was purely her own, and she broke the seal herself. And she looked at what was inside. Photographs first. 8 by 10, printed on heavy stock. She went through them slowly, one by one, the way her father had once taught her to read a document. Every detail, no skimming, no assumptions. The first was Nathan and Madison at a restaurant she recognized, the small Italian place on West 46th that Madison had told her was too crowded on weekends and not worth the trouble. They were in a corner booth. Madison's hand was on the table. Nathan's hand was covering it. The photograph was dated 14 months ago, 3 weeks after Nathan had introduced himself to Evelyn on the rooftop. She turned to the next. Nathan's phone screen, enlarged. A text exchange she recognized some of the language from. Phrases she had said to him, intimate and private, reconstructed in his messages to Madison, with the particular cruelty of being turned into evidence of her own gullibility. She read every word. Her hand stayed still. She was proud of that. Later, in a different life, she would be proud of that. Her hands did not shake while she read what Nathan had called her, what Madison had responded, the specific transaction they had made, Madison providing access, emotional intelligence, the exact language required to dismantle Evelyn's defenses, Nathan providing the exit strategy and the financial arrangement that would follow. There was a number at the bottom of one message exchange, a transfer amount. Evelyn recognized it. She had sent that same amount to Madison 18 months ago when Madison said she needed a private loan to cover her apartment during a gap between contracts. Madison had cried when she told her. Evelyn had told her not to cry, that it wasn't a favor, that it was what you did for someone you loved. The money had gone directly into the account Nathan used to fund his own surveillance of the Whitmore Company structure. She set the photographs down on the altar step. She set them down carefully, with the precise movements of someone managing their own nervous system through sheer concentration. Madison, she said. The cathedral had been quiet, but the quality of the quiet shifted. 300 heads turned toward the third row left, where Madison Harper had been standing since Alexander's entrance. She had lowered her phone at some point. She was holding it at her side now, and her face had undergone a significant reorganization since the moment Evelyn had seen her recording. The amusement was gone, replaced by something more complicated, something that had the rough shape of regret, but might have been closer to the calculation of how much regret to display. Evelyn, don't. Evelyn's voice did not rise. It didn't need to. Don't do the voice, don't do the face. I know both of those things. I know exactly what they are. Madison's chin came up slightly. An old habit. Evelyn had watched it for 23 years, the way Madison gathered herself when a conversation moved somewhere she hadn't prepared for. How long? Evelyn said. Evie. How long, Madison? A beat. The cathedral held it. 14 months, Madison said, quietly. Someone in the audience made a sound. Several people made sounds. Evelyn didn't hear any of them specifically, only the aggregate, the cathedral full of 500 witnesses arriving at the same understanding simultaneously. 14 months. 16 months of relationship. 2 months after Nathan introduced himself. You were there, Evelyn said, on the rooftop, that night. You introduced us. Madison said nothing. You brought him to me, Evelyn said. It wasn't... Madison stopped herself, recalibrated. Whatever she had been about to say, she'd decided against it. It was a business arrangement. Before I thought about what it would actually... Were you ever actually my friend? Evelyn asked. The question landed in the room the way certain questions did. Not dramatically, but with a specific, quiet weight that didn't allow for anything except the truth or the absence of it. Everyone in the building felt it. Madison's face moved through something. Evelyn watched it happen. Whatever it was, whatever complicated internal machinery was running behind Madison's eyes in that moment, it didn't resolve into anything clean or legible. It stayed complicated. And that was, in its own way, the most honest thing Madison Harper had said in the last 14 months. I thought I was, Madison said finally. For a long time I thought I was. But you weren't sure enough to stop. Madison looked down at the floor. The dusty rose bridesmaid gown looked different now. Still the same fabric, same cut, but wrong in a way that had nothing to do with the dress itself. Evelyn turned away from her. She turned back to Alexander Sterling, who had been standing 3 feet away through all of this without moving, without offering anything, without performing the discomfort that every other person in the building was visibly performing. He was simply present, waiting. You said there was more, Evelyn said. In the envelope, he said. Underneath the photographs. She reached back into the envelope. Financial documents. She had been reading financial documents since she was 17 years old, sitting beside her father in conference rooms, learning the architecture of money. She understood these faster than the photographs. She moved through the columns and the transfer records and the projected equity structures with the fluency of someone who had been built to read exactly this kind of paper. It took her less than 3 minutes to understand the full scope of it. Nathan's company had been bleeding for 2 years. 4 major developments in default. Investors withdrawing. A federal investigation into an inflated property valuation scheme that had already generated a sealed indictment. She saw the case number, the date, the signatures. Nathan Caldwell was 6 weeks away from public ruin regardless of this wedding. The Whitmore marriage wasn't just a strategic enhancement, it was the only life raft he had, and he had intended to use it and then shed it. There was a second document underneath the financial records. She almost missed it. It was shorter than the others, just 1 page, printed on plain paper, unsigned. It took her a moment to understand what she was reading, and then it took another moment to believe it, and then she looked up at Nathan with something that had moved entirely past the territory of hurt into a place she didn't have an existing name for. "A wager," she said. Nathan's face didn't move. "You made a bet," she said. "With who? With Madison? With someone else?" His silence was its own answer. "A written bet," she said, "about whether you could make me cry before I reached the end of the aisle." The sounds the cathedral made after that sentence were not human sounds, exactly. They were the kind of noise a large space makes when the air pressure changes suddenly. Collective and involuntary and impossible to source to any single person. Nathan's composure, which had been impressive and deliberate and absolutely essential to the version of himself he had built for this occasion, showed its first real fracture. It was small, a tightening around the jaw, a slight narrowing of the eyes. But Evelyn had spent 16 months learning his face, and she saw it. "You rehearsed this," she said. "The microphone. What you were going to say. The thing about the accommodations. You practiced it." "Evelyn, you practiced it to see how it landed." "I don't think this is the—" "How many times?" she asked. "In front of a mirror, did you practice it in front of Madison? Did she help you find the phrasing?" Nathan set the microphone down on the altar step with the careful movements of someone reclaiming a fragment of dignity from a situation that had gone somewhere he hadn't fully modeled. He straightened his tie. He looked at the audience, briefly, reflexively, the way a performer checked the house when the material wasn't landing. And Evelyn watched him do it and understood something she hadn't before. He needed them. Even now, even in the collapse of the plan. He needed the audience to be on his side, or at least to be watching, because without the audience, he was just a man standing in a cathedral surrounded by evidence of his own character. "The indictment," Alexander said. He said it conversationally, to no one in particular, the way you mentioned something that had just occurred to you. But the word moved through the room with the velocity of a stone dropped into still water. Nathan's head turned slowly. "Federal case number 24-CR-0847, Alexander said. "Inflated valuations on the Meridian Tower development, the Cross Point portfolio, and the Harbor District properties, sealed until Thursday of next week. You have 6 days before it becomes public record." He paused. "Or you had 6 days. I made a phone call this morning." Nathan stared at him. "The seal is lifted as of 4 o'clock today," Alexander said. "Every major financial publication has the case number. By the time you leave this building, your investors will know." The calculation Nathan did in the next 3 seconds was visible on his face, the way calculations sometimes were on people who had spent too long believing they were the smartest person in any given room. He was running the numbers, the frozen accounts, the investors in this very room, the indictment, the photographs now sitting on the altar step where anyone in the first 4 rows could lean forward and read the timestamps. "You can't," Nathan started. "I didn't do anything," Alexander said. "The indictment exists. I simply removed the obstacle between it and the people it belongs to." He tilted his head slightly. "You built this entire plan on the assumption that information could be controlled. That's a fundamental error. Information doesn't stay controlled. It finds the pressure points in whatever's containing it, and it moves." Nathan looked around the room. The specific way he looked around the room, the sweep of it, the sudden quality of assessment where there had been performance, told everyone watching that he was no longer the man who had walked into this building with a prepared speech and a practiced expression. He was looking for exits. He found the center aisle. He moved toward it, and the sound his shoes made on the stone floor was the loudest thing in the building, because 500 people held their breath to hear it. He made it 4 rows before William Whitmore's head of security. A man named Garrett, who had been with the family for 11 years and who stood 6'2" and moved with the blunt efficiency of someone who had once been professionally paid to be in difficult rooms, stepped into the aisle from the side door without being asked. Nathan stopped. Garrett didn't touch him. He simply occupied the space that would have required Nathan to make a decision about physical contact with a man who had 4 inches and 40 pounds on him. "There are people outside who would like to speak with you," Garrett said. "Federal officers. They've been waiting since noon." Nathan turned back toward the altar. Every face in the cathedral was turned toward him. 500 people who had spent their entire careers building and managing and protecting the reputations that opened the doors worth opening, all of them looking at a man who had just lost every door simultaneously. He stood in the aisle and he understood it. You could see him understand it. The specific quality of stillness that descended on a person who had run every remaining calculation and arrived at the same result each time. Evelyn watched him understand it. She expected to feel something: triumph, satisfaction, some compressed version of justice that would make the last 16 months feel rebalanced. She felt none of that. What she felt was exhaustion so complete it had weight, physical mass, something pressing on her chest and shoulders that had nothing to do with the ruined dress or the cold of the stone floor she'd been kneeling on 20 minutes ago. She felt Alexander move to stand beside her. Not behind her, not in front. Beside, with the specific spatial awareness of someone who understood the difference. "Are you all right?" he said. "No," she said. "That's the right answer." She looked at him. "You keep saying the thing I'm not expecting. I've been told that's a problem." "It's not," she said, before she'd decided to say it. He looked at her for a moment longer than was strictly necessary, and she looked back, and in the middle of the worst day of her life, inside the ruin of every plan she'd made for the next 30 years, something moved between them that she could not name and was not ready to examine. She looked away first. Her father was at her elbow. His hand found her arm, not gripping, just present, the way he had always communicated the things he didn't know how to say out loud. "We should go," William said. "Not yet," Evelyn said. She walked back to the altar. She picked up the photographs from the step where she'd set them. She looked at them one more time. The restaurant booth, the timestamp, the text exchange, the transfer record. She held them for a long moment. Then she set them back down, face up, where every person in the first 10 rows could see them clearly. "I want everyone in this room to see these," she said. Her voice had found a different register, not louder, but grounded, settled into her chest in a way that hadn't been there before. "Not because I want pity. I've had enough of that to last the rest of my life. Because I want every person here to understand that this—" She gestured at the photographs, at Nathan still standing in the aisle, at the ruined dress pooled at her feet, "is what it looks like when someone calculates that your need to be loved makes you the easiest kind of person to ruin." She let that sit. "I'm not easy," she said. "I was willing. There's a difference, and I'm not going to spend the rest of my life confused about which one I was." The cathedral was completely silent. William's hand tightened slightly on her arm. She turned to Alexander. He was watching her with the gray, steady attention she was already beginning to recognize as his default setting. Not the careful performance of attention that Nathan had given her, the kind that always felt like it was tracking her reactions for useful data, but something more direct and less comfortable, like being looked at by someone who had decided you were worth the effort of actually seeing. "You said you've been watching me," she said. "Yes." "Since when?" He considered this. 14 months before Nathan approached you on that rooftop, there was a charity event, Hargrove Foundation. You spent 40 minutes talking to the catering staff about the sourcing of the food. Not in a performative way, just genuinely interested. You knew the head chef's name. You asked about his family. Evelyn remembered the evening. She didn't remember being observed. "Why didn't you approach me?" she said. The answer took a moment longer than his other answers had. "Because of what I am," he said, "and what that would have put you next to." She held his gaze. "And now? And now someone put you next to something worse," he said, "while I was being careful." It was the most honest sentence anyone had said to her in 16 months, and it landed somewhere deep and specific, in the place where honest things landed when you had been starved of them long enough to feel the difference. Behind her, She heard the sound of footsteps in the aisle, federal officers coming in from the side entrance where Garrett had been standing, moving toward Nathan with the unhurried certainty of people who had all the time they needed because the situation was already resolved, and they all knew it. Nathan Caldwell said something. She didn't turn to hear what it was. She looked at Alexander Sterling and she understood, with a clarity that felt almost violent in its completeness, that she was standing at the exact place where her life divided. The before and the after, the self that had walked down that aisle 20 minutes ago, and the self that was going to have to be built out of whatever remained. She had no map for what came next. She had a ruined dress and her father's hand on her arm and a stranger's jacket across her shoulders and a cathedral full of witnesses. "I have a question," she said. "Ask it," Alexander said. "The envelope," she said. "The investigation, the indictment, the federal case. How long have you been building this?" He held her gaze without blinking. "Long enough," he said, "that there was no version of today where Nathan Caldwell left this building with anything that belonged to you." Evelyn felt the full weight of that sentence. Not just what it said, but what it meant about the months behind her, the surveillance she hadn't known was happening, the protection she hadn't known she was receiving, the intervention she hadn't known was coming. She felt the complexity of it, the discomfort of it, the fact that her rescue and her objectification had arrived from two different directions on the same day, and she was going to need a very long time in a very quiet room to sort out what she actually felt about all of it. But underneath all of that, underneath the exhaustion and the grief and the cold and the ruin, she felt something else that she recognized from a long time ago, from before 16 months of careful erosion, from the version of herself that existed before someone had spent over a year and a half teaching her to doubt it. She felt the specific, unqualified anger of someone who had survived something they were not going to survive quietly. She straightened her spine inside Alexander's jacket. She looked at her father. "Call the board," she said. "Every member. Tonight." William looked at her for a moment, reading her face the way he had always read it, the way fathers read the faces of children they have watched become adults. He found whatever he was looking for. "Tonight," he confirmed. She looked at Alexander. "And you," she said. "You and I are going to have a very long conversation about what exactly you know and how you know it and what you think that entitles you to." Something moved in Alexander's expression, not quite a smile, the anterior edge of one. "I know," he said. "That's not a reassurance," she said. "It wasn't meant to be." She held his gaze for 3 more seconds. Then she turned to walk out of the cathedral, not through the side door, not through any servant's entrance or private exit. Through the main doors, the same ones Alexander had come through, down the center aisle past every row of 500 silent witnesses, in the ruined dress and the borrowed jacket, with her father's hand on her arm and her spine completely straight. She was 2 rows from the doors when Madison called after her. "Evelyn." Her voice was raw in a way Evelyn hadn't heard since Madison's own mother died, 5 years ago. Raw and unpolished and genuinely broken, stripped of the social lacquer that Madison wore like a second skin. "I'm sorry. I know that doesn't... Evelyn stopped walking. She didn't turn around. "I know exactly what it doesn't," she said. And she pushed through the cathedral doors into the gray afternoon light of West 57th Street, where the traffic moved and the city continued its own business with complete indifference to the wreckage she was carrying, and where a black car was already waiting at the curb, and where her life, whatever shape it was going to take now, was waiting to begin. She did not look back. She didn't see Madison sink into the pew. She didn't see the way Nathan's arms were guided into position behind his back, the quiet mechanical efficiency of it, the thing that turned a man into a case number. She didn't see Alexander Sterling watch her walk out of the building and then turn to say something to William Whitmore that made the old man's expression shift from grief to something that hadn't been there before. She didn't see any of it. But in the car, sitting in the back seat with her father's jacket over Alexander's jacket, over the ruin of a dress that had been made to last a lifetime, Evelyn Whitmore reached into the pocket of Alexander's jacket without thinking and found a folded piece of paper. She opened it. It was a single line, handwritten, in a script that was spare and angular and utterly certain of itself. This was never going to be the end of your story. She stared at it for a very long time. Then she folded it back along its original crease and held it in her fist and looked out the window at the city going past. And she thought about the board meeting tonight, and the company her father had built, and the 16 months behind her, and the indictment that was public now, and the photographs on the altar step, and the crack in Nathan's composure when Alexander had said the case number out loud. She thought about Alexander standing in the aisle, saying long enough with the complete certainty of someone who had made a decision a long time ago and had never reversed it. She thought about what kind of man made that kind of decision about a woman he had never spoken to. She thought about what kind of woman she was going to be, starting now, starting today, starting with a board meeting at 8 o'clock tonight in a borrowed jacket with a piece of paper in her fist. The car turned onto the avenue. The cathedral disappeared behind them. The city opened up ahead, indifferent and enormous, and full of the next thing, the way it always was, the way it had always been, the way it would continue to be regardless of what any individual person carried or lost or chose or refused. Evelyn tightened her grip on the folded paper. And when her phone rang, the private line, the one only 6 people in the world had the number for, and she looked at the screen and saw a number she didn't recognize, she felt, in the base of her stomach, the particular sensation that preceded the moments that actually changed everything. She looked at the number for 3 full seconds. She answered. The number on her phone screen had no name attached to it, just digits. A New York area code, nothing else. The car was moving north on 6th Avenue, and her father was looking out the opposite window with the fixed attention of a man giving his daughter the only privacy available in a moving vehicle, and Evelyn pressed the phone to her ear and said nothing. She waited. Ms. Whitmore? The voice was female, professional. The specific flatness of someone trained to deliver information without editorial. My name is Sandra Reyes. I'm a senior investigator with the Financial Crimes Enforcement Division of the U.S. Attorney's Office for the Southern District of New York. I apologize for the timing of this call. I need 15 minutes of your time tonight. It concerns Whitmore Technologies, your position on the board, and a matter that cannot wait until morning. Evelyn looked at her own reflection in the darkened car window, the ruins of the dress, the borrowed jacket, the face that had spent the last 2 hours being rearranged by forces she hadn't chosen. 8 o'clock, she said. Whitmore Tower. Come to the executive entrance on 48th. She ended the call before Reyes could respond. Her father turned from the window. Who was that? Someone we're going to need to hear, Evelyn said. William studied her. Tonight's already the board meeting. I know. She put the phone face down on her knee. Reyes comes first. He nodded once. He didn't ask anything else. That was one of the things about her father that she had spent a long time taking for granted and was not taking for granted anymore. His capacity to read a situation and understand that questions sometimes cost more than they returned. The car pulled up to the Whitmore Tower garage entrance at 417. Evelyn went up through the private elevator and walked through the executive floor without stopping at her office, moving directly to the private suite at the end of the hall that her father used when he worked late. She locked the door behind her. She took off Alexander's jacket and hung it on the back of the chair. She looked at it for a moment. Then she picked up the phone and called her assistant. I need clothes sent to the tower, she said. Whatever's in my emergency bag in the lower right cabinet of my office, and I need the legal team here by 7:30. She ended the call and sat down on the floor. Not in a chair. The floor, with her back against the desk and her knees pulled up and the ruins of the ivory dress spread around her. And she sat there in the silence of the executive suite with the city going orange and gray outside the floor-to-ceiling windows. And she allowed herself exactly 12 minutes. She had learned this from her mother, the deliberate allocation of grief. Her mother had called it closing the valve. You opened it for a specific amount of time and you felt everything the situation required you to feel, and then you closed it, because the work didn't stop for the feeling, and the feeling didn't stop for the work. And the only way to hold both was to be very precise about when each one got its time. She spent the 12 minutes on the cathedral floor, on Nathan's foot on her train, on the photograph of Madison's hand and Nathan's hand in the restaurant booth 3 weeks after he introduced himself, on the word accommodations said into a microphone in front of 500 people with the specific intonation of a man who had practiced it. She felt all of it, the complete inventory of it. She didn't look away from any piece. Then she got up off the floor and went to the bathroom and washed her face with cold water and looked at herself in the mirror until she recognized the person looking back. "All right," she said to the reflection. "Not encouragement, just acknowledgement. The way you spoke to someone you needed to be honest with." By 7:45, the legal team was assembled in the conference room. By 8:10, Sandra Reyes arrived with a second investigator named Cho, and a physical briefcase that she set on the table with the careful deliberateness of someone who understood the weight of what was inside it. Evelyn sat at the head of the table. Her father sat to her left. The three senior board members who had made it in time sat down the right side. The legal team flanked both ends. Reyes opened the briefcase. She removed a document and slid it across the table to Evelyn. "The Caldwell indictment," Evelyn said without picking it up. "We're already aware." "The Caldwell indictment is the reason we're here," Reyes said, "but it isn't the subject of the meeting." She waited a beat. The professional pause of someone who had delivered difficult information in conference rooms before and knew how to frame the delivery. "During our investigation of Caldwell Capital's fraudulent valuation scheme, we identified a secondary financial instrument that traces back to an account inside Whitmore Technologies." The room went very still. "Inside Whitmore," Evelyn said, "a discretionary fund established approximately 22 months ago. The signatory authority belongs to your chief financial officer, Richard Holt. The fund has been used over the last 18 months to route payments, structured to fall below federal reporting thresholds, to accounts connected to Caldwell Capital's shell companies." Evelyn looked at the document. She picked it up. She read the account numbers, the dates, the transfer amounts. The amounts were not catastrophic individually, structured precisely to stay beneath the threshold. The aggregate over 18 months was $11 million. "Richard Holt has been your CFO for how long?" Reyes asked. 9 years, William said. His voice had dropped to something below its normal register, something that had the density of a man absorbing an impact he hadn't moved fast enough to avoid. "He was also a personal acquaintance of Nathan Caldwell," Reyes said. "The two men overlapped at Wharton. They maintained a financial relationship that predates Caldwell's introduction to your family by several years." Evelyn set the document down flat on the table. She aligned its edges precisely with the table edge. She did this because she needed her hands to do something controlled and deliberate while the rest of her nervous system processed what was being said. Richard Holt had been at her mother's funeral. He had sat 2 rows behind the family and cried, and she had noticed it and been moved by it, and she had told her father afterward that it said something good about the kind of organization they had built, that a man who managed money would grieve the woman who had shaped the company's values. She had told her father that. She remembered the specific words she had used. "Is Holt aware of today's proceedings?" she asked. "We believe he became aware approximately 2 hours ago," Reyes said. "He has not been reachable since 4:15. He's running," one of the board members said. "He's attempting to," Reyes said. "We have surveillance on his known addresses and travel documents. He won't get far." "That's not the point," Evelyn said. Everyone looked at her. "The point is that he had 2 hours. Between 4:15 and right now. What does a man with signatory authority over company accounts do with 2 hours when he knows the investigation is active?" Reyes held her gaze. "That's the correct question. Pull every transaction initiated from that fund in the last 48 hours, Evelyn said to her legal team. "Not a request. Tonight, I want timestamps, amounts, and destination accounts on my desk before midnight." The lead attorney, a woman named Patricia Sue, who had been with the company 12 years, was already on her phone. "There's a third element," Reyes said. Evelyn looked at her. Reyes reached into the briefcase again. She removed a second document, thinner, 2 pages, and slid it across to Evelyn with the specific care of someone who understood they were about to cause damage. Evelyn picked it up. She read the first paragraph. She read it again. Then she set it down the way she had set down the photographs in the cathedral, carefully, with the precise movements of someone managing the gap between what they were feeling and what they could afford to let show. "Tell me what this says in your own words," she said to Reyes. "I want to hear it spoken." Reyes looked at her steadily. 8 months ago, Nathan Caldwell filed a preliminary claim with a private arbitration board alleging a verbal agreement between himself and William Whitmore establishing an informal equity stake in Whitmore Technologies in exchange for introductions to specific overseas investors. The claim has not been formally submitted to any court, but the documentation supporting it, correspondence, signed meeting summaries, financial projections, appears to have been created using materials that originated inside this company. Manufactured, Evelyn said. Substantially, yes, but the foundational documents, the meeting summaries, carry Richard Holt's signature. The silence in the conference room was a different quality from the cathedral silence. The cathedral silence had been collective, 500 people absorbing shock together, the sound of a crowd processing something too large to process individually. This silence was the silence of 7 people who understood exactly what they were looking at and exactly what it meant for the next several years of their professional lives. William Whitmore stood up. He walked to the window. He put both hands on the glass and looked out at the city below and breathed, slowly, with the controlled deliberateness of a man managing physical pain. He had the company, William said, to the window, to the city, to no one specifically. If today had gone the way he planned, if Evelyn had married him, he would have had the equity claim, the internal fund, and board access through a spouse's influence. He turned around. He was going to own us. Yes, Baez, Reyes said, and Richard helped him build it. Over the last 18 months, yes. William looked at his daughter. Something moved across his face that Evelyn had seen only a handful of times in her life. At her mother's diagnosis, at the reading of the will, at a hostile acquisition attempt when Evelyn was 12 that had nearly broken the company her grandfather built. It was the look of a man who had been struck somewhere the armor didn't cover. I brought Richard into this company, William said. I vouched for him. I put him in the chair. You trusted someone, Evelyn said. That's not the same as building what he built. It's the same result. It's not. She heard her own voice, flat and certain, and coming from somewhere deeper than the morning had allowed her access to. You made a decision based on available information. He made a decision to betray it. Those are 2 different moral events. I'm not going to let you carry his crime on top of everything else tonight. William looked at her for a long moment. Then he sat back down. Reyes was watching Evelyn with the specific attention of someone who had expected a different kind of person in this chair and was adjusting her assessment in real time. What do you need from us tonight? Evelyn asked. Cooperation on the fund audit, Reyes said, and voluntary disclosure of the arbitration document to the court, preempting any claim Caldwell might file using it. You'll have both by midnight, Evelyn said. She looked at Patricia Sue, who nodded without being asked. There's one more thing. Reyes hesitated. An actual hesitation, not a professional pause, something that carried the specific weight of unwillingness. The surveillance materials that were used to build our case against Caldwell, the photographs, the financial records, the indictment timeline, did not originate with this office. Evelyn went still. They were delivered to us, Reyes said, 6 weeks ago, by an anonymous source. The materials were comprehensive, more comprehensive than anything we had developed through our own investigation over the prior 8 months. She folded her hands on the table. We used them. They were accurate, and they were legal. But I think you have a right to know that someone outside federal jurisdiction had a more complete picture of Nathan Caldwell's operations than we did. And that person chose to deliver that picture to us rather than use it privately. Evelyn looked at the table. She thought about the envelope, the photographs, the financial records, the indictment case number. She thought about Alexander saying long enough with the certainty of a man who had already built the architecture of this day before he walked through those cathedral doors. Do you know who the source was? She asked. We have a hypothesis, Reyes said carefully. We don't have confirmation, and I'm not in a position to pursue it aggressively, given that the materials were accurate and served the interests of the investigation. But you know, Evelyn said. Reyes held her gaze. I know enough to understand that the person who sent us that package has access to information-gathering capabilities that are not available to ordinary private citizens. The room absorbed that. The board members exchanged looks that they controlled carefully, but not completely. Patricia Sue made a note on her legal pad without looking up. William Whitmore looked at his daughter with a question he didn't ask. The meeting ended at 9:50. Reyes and Cho took their briefcase and left through the executive entrance. The legal team dispersed to their offices to begin the audit. The board members went to find their cars. Evelyn sat at the head of the empty conference table. Her father sat across from her. For a moment, neither of them said anything. The city outside the windows was fully dark now, lit in the way the city was always lit, relentless and orange and indifferent. "Sterling," William said. "Yes," Evelyn said. "He built an investigation that federal investigators couldn't match in 8 months." "Yes." "And then he delivered it to the government instead of using it as leverage." Evelyn looked at her father. "That's what's interesting, isn't it?" William leaned back in his chair. He had the expression of a man recalibrating something fundamental. A man with that kind of capability who uses it to hand someone else a weapon rather than wield it himself. "Either he's genuinely trying to protect me," Evelyn said, "or he wants something from this company that he's decided patience will get him better than pressure." She paused. "And I can't tell which one it is." "Does it have to be one?" her father asked. She looked at him. "People are more than one thing," William said. "You know that better than anyone." Her phone buzzed on the table. She looked at the screen. Unknown number. Different from the one Reyes had called from. She stared at it for 3 seconds, then picked it up. "Miss Whitmore." The voice was male, low and unhurried. Not Alexander, she would have recognized that. Someone she didn't know. "My name is Victor Lane. I represent certain parties who have a shared interest in Whitmore Technologies and who have become aware of tonight's developments." A pause, practiced and deliberate. "We'd like to discuss a proposal before you take any formal action with the federal investigators." "I've already taken formal action," Evelyn said. A beat. "That's unfortunate." "Is it?" "For some people, yes." Another pause. "There are aspects of the Caldwell arrangement that your investigators have not yet uncovered. Aspects that, should they surface in an uncontrolled way, would create difficulties not just for Mr. Caldwell, but for individuals connected to your company at a level closer than Richard Holt." Something cold moved through her. "What individuals?" "That's the conversation I'd like to have in person," Lane said. "Tomorrow morning, 8 o'clock. I'll send the address." "Who are you representing?" "People who were in your cathedral today," he said, "and who would prefer that certain photographs do not receive broader circulation." "People who were in your cathedral today," he said, "and who would prefer that certain photographs do not receive broader circulation." Evelyn gripped the phone. Across the table, her father was watching her face. "If you're in a position to make threats," she said, "you're in a position to make them to my attorneys." "I'm not making threats," Lane said pleasantly. "I'm extending an invitation. What you do with the information about Richard Holt and about the 3 board members whose signatures appear on documents we haven't discussed yet is entirely your decision. I just want to make sure you have the full picture before you make it." 3 board members. Evelyn looked at the empty chairs around the conference table. She thought about the 3 board members who had been here tonight, who had sat in those chairs and listened to Reyes and looked at each other with careful, controlled expressions. She thought about Patricia Sue making a note without looking up. "Send the address," Evelyn said. Her voice was absolutely steady. "I'll be there." She ended the call. William was already leaning forward. "Evelyn." 3 board members," she said. He went pale, not dramatically, not the pallor of a man surprised, but the pallor of a man who had been holding something back and just watched the barrier give way. She saw it happen. She watched her father's face perform the specific reorganization of a man who had known something and had decided not to say it, and was now watching that decision collapse. "You knew," she said. "I suspected," he said. "After the Holt call tonight, I suspected. I didn't have—" "Who?" "Evelyn. Dad." She said it the way she hadn't said it since she was a child, stripped of the professional register, all the way down to the bone of it. "Who?" He said 3 names. She had known all 3 of them for decades. She had known them at Christmas parties when she was small enough to stand between their legs. She had known them at her mother's funeral. She had known them in boardrooms and strategy sessions and the quiet, trusted spaces where the company's future was decided. She sat with the names for a long moment. Then she stood up. She picked up Alexander's jacket from the back of the chair. She folded it over her arm. She looked at her father. "In the morning," she said, "I'm going to need you to trust that I know what I'm doing." "Do you?" he asked. Not unkindly, Genuinely. She thought about the envelope, the handwritten note. This was never going to be the end of your story. She thought about a man who built a federal case and handed it to the government and then walked into a cathedral with nothing but a jacket and a sealed envelope and the specific calm of someone who had already decided how the day was going to end. She thought about what it meant to be in a room with someone who had that kind of capability and had chosen, so far, to use it on her behalf. She thought about so far. Not entirely, she said to her father, but I know who might. She left the conference room and walked to the private elevator and pressed the lobby button and stood in the mirrored box as it descended, watching her own face in the polished steel doors, looking at a woman she was still in the process of becoming, in a borrowed jacket with 3 names in her head and a meeting at 8 o'clock tomorrow morning at an address she didn't have yet, and the slowly crystallizing understanding that the cathedral had not been the end of the attack. It had been the opening move. The lobby doors opened. The executive entrance was quiet at this hour. Just the night security guard at the desk and the sound of the city beyond the glass doors. Evelyn walked toward the exit. The black car was at the curb. Not her father's driver. A different car, longer, darker, with a driver she didn't recognize behind the wheel. She stopped on the sidewalk. The rear window went down. Alexander Sterling looked at her from the back seat, and his expression held exactly the same quality it had held in the cathedral. Direct, steady, absolutely without the performed concern of someone who wanted her to notice he was concerned. "Get in," he said. She looked at him for a moment. She thought about what Reyes had said, about the package, about capabilities not available to ordinary private citizens, about the specific nature of a man who built something that powerful and gave it away. "Victor Lane," she said. Something shifted in Alexander's expression. Small, precise. The specific reorganization of a face that had just received information it hadn't expected to receive this quickly. "He called you," Alexander said. 40 minutes ago." A pause. The city moved around them. Cabs, pedestrians, the ordinary machinery of a night that had no idea what kind of day it was concluding. "Get in the car, Evelyn," Alexander said. And the way he said her name, not Ms. Whitmore, not the careful social distance of someone maintaining protocol, just her name, plain and direct, and carrying the weight of 14 months of watching from a distance, landed somewhere in her chest that she was not prepared for and did not have the bandwidth to examine. She got in the car, the door closed, the car pulled away from the curb, the tower disappeared behind them. "Who is Victor Lane?" she said. Alexander looked at the street ahead. For the first time since she had seen him walk through the cathedral doors, something in his posture changed, a tightening across the shoulders, a stillness that was different from his usual stillness, the kind of stillness that came not from certainty, but from the opposite of it. "Victor Lane," Alexander said, "is the reason I started watching you in the first place." Evelyn turned to look at him. "He's been building a position against this company for 3 years," Alexander said. "Nathan Caldwell was his instrument. Richard Holt was his instrument. The board members, I know about the board members," she said. He turned to look at her then. His gray eyes were unreadable in the car's low light, but she was beginning to understand that unreadable didn't mean empty. It meant contained, deliberately, by someone who had spent a long time learning to hold things without letting them show. "He's going to try to use the morning meeting to find out how much you know," Alexander said. "And then he's going to make you an offer that looks like a way out and functions as a trap." "What does he actually want?" Alexander held her gaze. "He wants what Nathan wanted," he said. "But unlike Nathan, he's been patient enough to build 5 different ways to get it. We removed one today. The others are still standing, and Lane knows we removed one, which means he knows I'm involved, which means—" He stopped. She watched his face. "Which means what?" she said. He looked at her with an expression she hadn't seen on him before. Not calculation, not the quiet certainty that had been his consistent register since the cathedral. Something more exposed than that. Something that had the quality of a man arriving at a moment he had known was coming and finding it harder than he had prepared for. "Which means he's going to use you to get to me," Alexander said, and I didn't account for how far he'd be willing to go to do it. The car moved through the city in silence for 3 seconds that felt much longer. "Tell me everything," Evelyn said. Alexander looked at her for a moment. Then he reached forward and pressed the intercom to the driver. "Take the long route," he said. The driver nodded. Alexander sat back. He looked at Evelyn Whitmore, in the ruins of her wedding day, in his jacket, with the names of 3 traitors in her head, and a meeting tomorrow morning with a man who intended to finish what Nathan Caldwell had started. And he began to tell her the truth about Victor Lane, and about himself, and about the 3 years of shadow work that had led to this specific car on this specific night. And as he spoke, Evelyn listened with the complete, unblinking attention of a woman who had finally understood that the day she had thought was the worst of her life had only been the beginning of something much larger and much more dangerous than a man who hadn't loved her. Alexander talked for 40 minutes. He talked the way people talked when they had been holding something for a long time and had finally found the right container for it. Not rushing, not performing, just laying it down piece by piece with the care of someone who understood that the order mattered. Evelyn sat beside him in the dark car and listened without interrupting, which was something she had learned from her father and had spent most of her adult life being too polite to actually practice. She practiced it now. She needed the complete picture before she touched any piece of it. Victor Lane had been born into old money that had gone bad slowly, the way old money sometimes did, not through catastrophe, but through the gradual erosion of people who had inherited wealth without inheriting the discipline that built it. By 43, he had rebuilt his position through a series of acquisitions that looked legitimate on the surface and were supported underneath by a network of financial instruments and political relationships that existed specifically to make illegal movement of capital look like ordinary business. He operated through intermediaries. He had never been directly connected to anything that could be prosecuted. He had been investigated 4 times by 3 different federal agencies and had walked away from every inquiry without a mark. Nathan Caldwell had been his man for 6 years. Richard Holt had been turned 2 years ago through a combination of financial incentive and leverage that Alexander declined to specify, but that Evelyn understood from the way he said it to involve something Holt had done that he couldn't afford to have known. The 3 board members, Evelyn held their names in her head like stones she was deciding whether to drop, had been Lane's connections inside Whitmore Technologies since before William's health began to decline. They hadn't been recruited. They had been cultivated, slowly, through the social architecture of shared clubs and shared interests and the particular vulnerability of men who had spent their careers adjacent to power without ever quite holding it themselves. Lane wanted Whitmore Technologies specifically because of a patent portfolio the company had spent 11 years and $300 million developing, a suite of infrastructure encryption protocols that 3 foreign governments had already approached the company about acquiring. The company had declined every approach. Lane had identified the portfolio as a once-in-a-decade asset and had spent 3 years building the mechanism to take it. The mechanism was almost complete. The arbitration claim, Evelyn said. If it had been filed after a marriage that gave Caldwell board access, Alexander said, combined with the Holt Fund and the 3 board members, Lane would have had enough internal leverage to force a special vote. He didn't need a majority of the board. He needed enough confusion and enough legal pressure to trigger a settlement that included licensing rights for the patent portfolio. And the licensing rights would go to a holding company in the Caymans, Alexander said, which traces back through 4 intermediary structures to Lane. Evelyn looked at the city going past the window. He was going to steal 11 years of our work. He was going to purchase it, Alexander said, for $1, through a process that would have looked to any outside observer like a legitimate resolution of a messy family business dispute. She absorbed this. Why didn't you go to the federal investigators yourself? She asked. You had the materials. You had the case. Alexander was quiet for a moment. Because the moment I present materials to federal investigators, I become the story. My name on a filing becomes the lead. And Lane has spent 3 years building a narrative about me that would have discredited everything I handed them before anyone read page 2. What narrative? He looked at her. That I'm attempting a hostile takeover of Whitmore Technologies through your family. That my interest in you is the acquisition strategy, not Lane's. That I manufactured the Caldwell evidence to clear my own path. She held his gaze. Is that true? He didn't look away. No. But you can see why I'd need to ask. Yes, he said. And you should keep asking. Every step of this. Don't stop asking. She turned back to the window. The car had been making long circuits of the park, the driver understanding without being told that they were not going anywhere yet. The morning meeting, she said. Lane sending Lane's man to me directly. Why? Because you went to federal investigators tonight instead of calling him, Alexander said. He didn't expect that. He expected shock, grief, disorientation, a woman 24 hours out of the worst day of her life, making decisions from the center of that. He expected to have the morning to shape what you knew before you acted. He paused. You didn't give him the morning. So he's adjusting. He's forcing the conversation earlier than he planned, which means he's going to come at you with less preparation than he wanted, and he's going to compensate with something he thinks will immobilize you. Alexander's voice was measured. He's going to offer you a version of the truth that makes me look like the threat and himself look like the solution. And if I believe him, then he gets what he came for, and I go to prison for a financial crime I didn't commit, and Whitmore Technologies gets restructured into something your grandfather would not recognize. Evelyn let that sit for exactly as long as it needed to. What do you need from me tomorrow morning? She said. Alexander looked at her with the expression she was beginning to understand was his version of surprise. Not wide-eyed, not dramatic, just a slight opening of something he normally kept more controlled. You're going. Of course I'm going. Evelyn, he's going to tell me things, she said. Things that are either true or designed to look true. Either way, I need to hear them from him directly, in a room where I can watch his face. She turned to Alexander. You know what I need from you tomorrow morning. He held her gaze for 3 seconds. Everything I have on Lane's structure, the intermediary companies, the holding chain, the names. Tonight, she said. He pulled out his phone. They spent the next 2 hours in the car and then in Alexander's office on the 48th floor of a building on Park Avenue that had no visible signage and a lobby that felt like the inside of something that had decided to make itself unnoticeable on purpose. The office itself was large and spare. A desk, 2 chairs, a credenza with files she couldn't see the labels on, and windows that looked south toward the compressed luminosity of Midtown at midnight. He laid documents across the desk in an order that told its own story, and she stood beside him and read them. And when she had questions, he answered them without hedging. And when she pointed to something that didn't track, he didn't defend it, he explained it. And the distinction between those two things was something she had learned to measure very precisely over the course of her career. By 1:30 in the morning, she had the complete picture. By 2 o'clock, she had a plan. It was not a comfortable plan. It required things from her that she did not have a guaranteed capacity to deliver, and it required things from Alexander that operated in spaces that the law described with a particular ambiguity reserved for activities that weren't quite legal and weren't quite not. She sat with the discomfort of that and didn't pretend it wasn't there. If this goes wrong, she said, it won't. If it does, he looked at her steadily. Then I take the exposure. Not you, not your father, not the company. That's not what I was going to ask, she said. He waited. If it goes wrong, she said, and you take the exposure, what happens to what you were building, the investigation, everything you've been doing for 3 years? He was quiet for a moment. It stops. And Lane walks. Yes. She nodded. She absorbed the full weight of what she was agreeing to carry into a room tomorrow morning with a man who had spent 3 years engineering the destruction of her family's company. Get me there by 7:45, she said. I want to be in position before he arrives. He looked at her for a moment with an expression that had nothing of strategy in it, something simpler and less controlled, something that had the quality of a man being surprised by the specific shape of a person he had been watching from a distance for a long time. All right, he said. She picked up his jacket from the chair where she'd set it hours ago. She put it back on, not for warmth, for something harder to name than warmth. She left without looking back, which she was becoming very good at. The address Lane's man sent arrived at 6:47 the next morning. A building in the financial district, a conference suite on the 32nd floor of a structure that housed 12 different corporate entities and belonged through 2 layers of holding companies, to none of them visibly. Evelyn recognized the architecture of it. She had read about it in Alexander's documents the night before. She arrived at 7:41 in a charcoal suit and heels and her own face. No performance in it. Nothing arranged to communicate anything except that she had slept 4 hours and was here and was paying attention. Alexander's team, 3 people she had not met and whose functions he had described only in the broadest terms, were already in position in the building. She didn't look for them. She walked directly to the elevator. The conference suite was on the northeast corner. Floor-to-ceiling windows. A table that seated 12 with only 2 chairs currently placed, one at the head, one to its right. Victor Lane was already there. He was 60 or close to it, compact and well-maintained in the way of men who had spent their entire adult lives in rooms that rewarded the appearance of control. Silver hair cut close. A suit that was expensive without being ostentatious. The kind of man who had learned to make his power felt through absence of display rather than presence of it. He stood when she entered. He extended a hand. She shook it. His grip was measured. Not aggressive, not limp. The grip of someone who had made a precise calculation about how much to reveal through physical contact. "Ms. Whitmore," he gestured to the chair to his right. "Please." She sat. She folded her hands on the table. She waited. He sat. He looked at her with the specific, careful attention of a man taking an inventory. "Yesterday was a difficult day," he said. "Yes," she said. "I want to acknowledge that before we discuss anything else. What happened to you in that cathedral was, regardless of the circumstances surrounding it, genuinely cruel. Nathan's methodology was excessive. I told him that." She held his gaze, kept her face neutral, filed away the fact that he had just confirmed a direct line of communication with Nathan. Not secondhand, not through intermediaries. He had told him. Present tense relationship. "You had a conversation with federal investigators last night," Lane said. "I did." "That was premature." "Was it?" "You acted on incomplete information." He leaned forward slightly, not aggressively, just closing the distance by a calculated inch. "There are aspects of the situation involving Whitmore Technologies that the federal investigation has not yet reached. Aspects that, if they surface in the wrong sequence, create very serious problems for people you care about." "Which people?" she said. "Your father, specifically." She let 1 second pass. "My father has no involvement in anything connected to Caldwell or Holt." "No," Lane agreed. "But his signature appears on documents approving the fund that Holt subsequently misused, documents he signed without full understanding of their purpose. I want to be clear about that. I'm not suggesting William Whitmore acted with intent. I'm telling you that the paper trail, without context, reads ambiguously. And federal investigators are not always in the business of seeking context." She looked at him. He held her gaze with the specific patience of a man who had watched this play out before. The moment when the person across the table processed the threat and began to calculate the cost of resistance. "What do you want?" she said. "I want a conversation," he said, "about the patent portfolio, about a licensing arrangement that benefits both parties, about a resolution that keeps your father's name exactly where it belongs, out of a federal filing." "And Alexander Sterling," she said. Something moved in Lane's eyes, a tightening, fast and controlled, but she caught it. "Sterling is a complication," Lane said carefully. "He's sitting in the lobby of this building," Evelyn said. Lane went still. "He's been in this building since 7:15, she said. "The 3 people he brought with him have your financial structure. The full chain, Caymans through the 2 Luxembourg entities to the primary holding account, on a drive that is currently connected to a server that your technical team has not been able to isolate because they didn't know to look for it until 11 minutes ago when I texted the word open to a number I memorized last night." She watched his face. "The drive also contains the original Lane Caldwell correspondence. Not the copies you know about. The originals. From 6 years ago, before Nathan learned to use encrypted channels." Lane's composure held. It held the way well-built structures held under load, visibly, effortfully, with the specific rigidity of something that was not going to hold indefinitely. "You came here to threaten me," he said. "I came here because you asked me to," she said. You wanted a conversation. We're having it. This is not... He stopped. Reset. What Sterling has built against me is inadmissible. It was gathered through methods that... It was delivered to federal investigators 6 weeks ago, she said. They built their own case from it. The materials they filed are theirs, gathered through their own process. Whatever questions exist about Alexander Sterling's methods are separate from the evidence that is now inside the U.S. Attorney's Office. She watched the calculation run across his face. He was fast. She gave him that. Faster than Nathan had been, faster than Richard Holt had probably ever been. He ran the variables in real time and arrived at the correct answer quickly, which was that the position he had spent 3 years constructing had just been separated from its foundation. The board members, he said, you don't have enough to move on them. Patricia Sue filed the voluntary disclosure at midnight, Evelyn said. It named the fund, the transfers, and 3 individuals whose signatures appear on related internal documents. It did not name them as targets. It named them as persons of interest whose cooperation would be sought. She paused. 2 of them called my father before 6 this morning. Lane looked at the table for 3 seconds. 3 full seconds. And in a man of his discipline, 3 seconds was a very long time. What do you want? He said. He said it the way she had said it to him, flat and direct, stripped of the negotiating texture of the previous 20 minutes. I want you to withdraw, she said. Every claim, every instrument, every position Caldwell was holding on your behalf, and every instruction Holt executed on your instruction. I want it dismantled in writing, through your attorneys, by 5 o'clock tomorrow. And if I don't, then the originals go to the Southern District tonight, she said. Not the copies. The originals with the 6-year timeline, with the Caldwell correspondence, with the communication logs that show every instruction you gave Richard Holt, including the 3 that explicitly reference my father's signature as a mechanism to be exploited. He looked up. Exploited. Your word, she said. In an email to Caldwell dated 11 months ago, you used the word exploit in reference to my father's trust in his CFO. I have the email. The room was very quiet. Outside, the city was fully awake. The sound of it came through the glass at a frequency that was more vibration than noise, the constant low machinery of a place that ran regardless of what happened inside any single room within it. Lane sat back in his chair. He did it slowly, with the deliberate quality of a man reclaiming his posture, because his posture was the last thing in the room he still controlled. Sterling coached you, he said. I read documents, she said, and I understood them. Sterling didn't coach me. He gave me information, and I made decisions from it. There's a difference. She held his gaze. You spent 3 years believing that what made me accessible was the thing that made me easy to manage. You were wrong about that. Something crossed Lane's face that she hadn't seen on it yet. Not anger, not calculation, not the careful performance of reasonableness. Something older and rawer than any of those. The specific expression of a man confronting the gap between his model of a situation and the actual situation. I'll need 48 hours, he said. You have until 5 o'clock tomorrow, she said. Not 48, 29. He looked at her for a long moment. You understand that this doesn't end here. I know, she said, but it ends for you. She stood. She picked up the small portfolio she'd brought in with her and tucked it under her arm. She walked to the conference room door. Ms. Whitmore. She stopped. She didn't turn. Sterling's world is not compatible with yours, Lane said. Whatever you think is happening between you, whatever he's made you believe about his intentions, the man operates in spaces that will eventually destroy everything adjacent to him. I've watched it happen. People around him don't survive intact. She stood in the doorway with her back to him and her hand on the frame, and she thought about a man kneeling on a cathedral floor with a jacket. She thought about 40 minutes in a car and 2 hours at a desk and documents laid down in an order that told the truth. She thought about long enough said with the certainty of someone who had made a decision and not reversed it. She thought about what it felt like to be told, for the entirety of your adult life, that the things that were trying to help you were the things you should be afraid of. Thank you for the meeting, she said. She walked out. The elevator was waiting. She stepped in and pressed the lobby button and stood in the mirrored box and let herself breathe for the first time since she had sat down across from Victor Lane. Her hands were steady. She was surprised they were steady. She checked them deliberately, set both hands flat against her thighs, not a tremor. The doors opened. Alexander was standing in the lobby with his phone in his hand and his eyes on the elevator before the doors were fully open, with the specific attention of someone who had been counting seconds. He looked at her face. He read it the way she was beginning to understand he read most things, fast and precisely and without needing it explained. "Done?" he said. "Not yet," she said, "but close." She crossed the lobby to him. "He needs 29 hours to dismantle. We need to make sure he actually does it." "I have people on every entity in the chain," Alexander said. "I know." She stopped in front of him. "I need you to understand something." He waited. "Lane told me you'd destroy everything adjacent to you," she said. "That people around you don't survive intact." His jaw tightened slightly. "I'm not asking you to defend yourself," she said. "I'm telling you what he said so there's no version of the next 24 hours where you think I didn't hear it." She held his gaze. "I heard it, and I walked out of that room anyway. I need you to understand what that means." He looked at her for a long moment. Something moved in his expression that was more unguarded than anything she had seen on his face. Not the controlled steadiness of the cathedral, not the measured certainty of the car, but something underneath all of that. Something that had the texture of a man being seen in a way he had not prepared for, and finding it both harder and less unwelcome than he expected. "I understand," he said. Her phone rang. She looked at the screen. Patricia Sue. She answered. "The 2 board members who called your father this morning," Patricia said without preamble. "They're cooperating. Full disclosure. Signed affidavits by 9 o'clock. "Good. There's a complication." A pause. "The 3rd one isn't cooperating, and his attorney called the U.S. Attorney's Office 20 minutes ago with a counterfiling. He's alleging that the voluntary disclosure was made under duress and that Alexander Sterling coerced your signature on the documents." Evelyn went still. "He's naming Sterling as the primary architect of a scheme to seize control of Whitmore Technologies," Patricia said. "He's filed for an emergency injunction freezing all transactions between Sterling Holdings and any Whitmore entity." Evelyn looked at Alexander. His phone was already in his hand. His face had the expression of someone receiving information from a different source simultaneously. One of his people, she understood, who had been watching the same chessboard from a different angle. "The injunction," he said, to whoever was on his line. His voice was flat and precise. "When was it filed?" He listened. His jaw tightened again. More this time, the visible work of keeping his expression controlled under something that was pushing against the control. He lowered the phone. He looked at Evelyn. 11 minutes ago, he said, Judge Harlan Briggs, Southern District. Briggs has been on Lane's..." He stopped. "I know this judge. The injunction will be granted within the hour." "Can we appeal?" "Not fast enough." His voice was still controlled, but the edges of it had changed. She could hear something underneath it that hadn't been there before. Not panic. Closer to the sound of a man arriving at a calculation he hadn't wanted to arrive at. "If the injunction holds, Sterling Holdings is frozen. Every account, every asset, every piece of leverage I have against Lane's network becomes inaccessible." "And Lane walks." "Lane walks," Alexander said. "And the 3rd board member." He stopped again. She looked at him. "Who is it?" His eyes held something she hadn't seen before. The specific quality of a man who was about to say something that was going to cost him. "His name is Gerald Marsh," Alexander said. "He's been on the Whitmore board for 16 years. He's also the only board member with independent signatory authority over the patent portfolio in your father's absence." He held her gaze. "If Marsh files the injunction and it holds and my assets freeze, he can initiate a unilateral licensing agreement within the next 18 hours before your father can convene an emergency board session to override him." The full picture assembled itself with the speed and clarity of something that had been there all along, waiting for the last piece. Lane hadn't come to the meeting to negotiate. He had come to hold her in a room while Gerald Marsh filed the injunction. The whole conversation, the threat about her father, the offer about licensing, the warning about Alexander, had been 40 minutes of deliberate delay. She looked at Alexander. "How long to the Whitmore building from here?" she said. 12 minutes. "Gerald Marsh," she said. "Where is he right now?" Alexander was already on his phone. He spoke 3 words to whoever answered. He listened for 4 seconds. He looked at her. "He's in the building," Alexander said. "He entered the executive floor 7 minutes ago." She was already moving toward the door. "Evelyn." Alexander's hand caught her arm. Not gripping, just contact. The way you made contact with someone moving too fast in a direction that had a wall in it. She stopped. She turned. His face was close, and his expression was the most unguarded she had seen it, the most stripped of the layers he carried like infrastructure. "If Marsh initiates the signature before you get there, if we're 12 minutes too late, there is one other way to stop the licensing from going through. But it requires me to do something that I told you I wouldn't do without your knowledge." She looked at him. "What?" "Lane's primary holding account," he said. "I can move the assets. Not take them. Move them into a suspended account that requires dual authorization to access. It would freeze his ability to execute the licensing even if Marsh signs, because without the holding account active, the transfer vehicle doesn't exist." "Is that legal?" she said. He held her gaze. "It's in a gray space." "How gray?" "Dark gray," he said. She looked at him for exactly 3 seconds. "Do it," she said. He didn't move immediately. He looked at her with an expression that had the quality of a man making sure, absolutely sure, that he had heard correctly, that the woman in front of him had said what he thought she said, that he wasn't filling in what he wanted to hear over what was actually there. "Evelyn Alexander." She said his name the way he had said hers the night before, plain and direct and carrying weight. "Do it. I'll handle Marsh, you handle Lane's account. We have 11 minutes. He held her gaze for 1 more second. Then he made the call. They split in the lobby. He moved toward the building's secondary exit, phone to his ear, already speaking in a clipped shorthand she couldn't follow. She went through the front doors into the morning air and got into the car that Garrett had waiting at the curb and said 1 word. "Whitmore." The car moved into traffic. She gripped the portfolio on her lap and watched the blocks go by and counted them and felt her pulse in her fingertips and thought about Gerald Marsh entering the executive floor 7 minutes ago, moving through the corridors she had walked since childhood, past the offices of people who had worked for her family for decades, toward the room where her grandfather's patent portfolio sat in a legal structure that a 16-year board member could access with a single signature. She thought about what her mother had said once, near the end, in the particular clarity that sometimes came in the last weeks. She had taken Evelyn's hand and said, "The people who want to take things from you will always tell you that resistance is the unreasonable position. Don't believe them. Unreasonable is just the word they use for anyone who won't give them what they came for." She had been 28 when her mother said that. She had thought she understood it. She understood it differently now. The car pulled up to Whitmore Tower at 8:49. She was out before it stopped fully, through the executive entrance, past the security desk. Garrett was already on his radio. Into the elevator, pressing the button for the executive floor with the flat of her palm. The doors opened on the 31st floor. Gerald Marsh was standing at the end of the corridor outside the patent documentation room, his hand on the door handle, a folder under his arm, and an expression on his face that lasted exactly 1 second before it was replaced by something else entirely. "Evelyn," he said. She walked toward him. Her heels on the floor were the only sound in the corridor, and each one was deliberate, and she covered the distance between them without slowing down and stopped 3 feet away from him and looked at him. 62 years old, silver-haired, the man who had given her a telescope for her 10th birthday, because she had mentioned once at a family dinner that she wanted to see the rings of Saturn. And she held the full weight of that in one hand and the full weight of what he had done in the other, and she looked at him and said, "Step away from the door, Gerald." His hand tightened on the handle. "You don't understand the full situation." "I understand all of it," she said. "I've understood it since 1:30 this morning. Step away from the door." "Lane has things—" He stopped. His face was doing something complicated. The specific internal weather of a man who had committed to a position and was finding the position harder to hold in the physical presence of the person he had been working against in the abstract. There are things he could release. About the company. About your father. I didn't have a choice. You had every choice, she said. You made them. And now you're going to step away from that door. Or I'm going to call the 2 federal investigators who are currently in this building and waiting for my signal, and you are going to spend the rest of the day explaining to them exactly how many choices you made and when you made them. Marsh looked at her. He was breathing faster than he should have been for a man who had done nothing more physical than walk down a corridor. Lane is currently dealing with a problem that makes you a secondary concern, she said. His holding account has been suspended. The injunction he filed against Sterling Holdings is going to face a counter motion in the next hour that will demonstrate the filing was made in coordination with an ongoing federal investigation into financial fraud. His attorney is going to advise him to retract before noon. She held Marsh's gaze. You have about 45 minutes before he stops being able to protect you, which means you have 45 minutes to decide whether you're a witness or a defendant. Gerald Marsh stood in the corridor outside the patent documentation room with his hand on the door handle and his folder under his arm, and his face carrying the specific devastation of a man who had believed, until this moment, that the plan was still viable, that the variables were still manageable, and who had just understood all at once that they were not. His hand came off the door handle. The folder dropped to his side. He stood in the corridor and he looked at Evelyn Whitmore, the girl he had given a telescope to, the woman she had become, in a charcoal suit with her spine straight and her hands steady and her face carrying nothing that resembled the person who had been on her knees on a cathedral floor 20 hours ago, and something in his own face gave way. What do I do? He said. Quiet. Stripped of everything. You call your attorney, Evelyn said, right now, and you tell them you want to cooperate. He nodded. He took out his phone with a hand that was not quite steady. Evelyn took out her own phone and sent one word to Patricia Sue. Then she sent one word to Alexander. The word was, done. His response came back in under 10 seconds. 3 words. Account released. Lane's gone. She stood in the corridor outside the room that held 11 years of her family's work and looked at those 3 words on her phone screen and felt, not triumph, not the clean resolution of something completed, but the specific, complicated sensation of a person who has fought through a space they never wanted to be in and come out the other side still standing, still themselves, changed in ways they cannot yet fully measure. Her phone rang again. Unknown number. She looked at it. She thought, not again. She answered. Ms. Whitmore, a different voice than Lane's, younger, neutral, carrying the particular register of someone reading from a prepared statement. This is the communications office of the U.S. Attorney for the Southern District of New York. We're notifying relevant parties that Nathan Caldwell was formally arraigned at 8:15 this morning on 14 counts of securities fraud and financial conspiracy. Bail was denied. We're also notifying you that a second individual, a pause, a paper sound, the specific rustling of someone confirming a name before speaking it, Richard Holt, was taken into federal custody at 6:40 this morning at JFK Airport attempting to board an international flight. He is in custody and cooperating. Thank you, Evelyn said. She ended the call. She stood in the corridor for a moment longer. Garrett appeared at the far end, radio in hand, reading her face and finding what he was looking for. The signal that the immediate crisis had resolved. She nodded to him. He nodded back. She turned and walked toward her father's office at the end of the corridor, the one with the window that looked south toward the island's compressed and relentless skyline. And she was almost there when the elevator at the far end of the floor opened and Alexander Sterling stepped out. He was still in yesterday's suit, which told her he hadn't slept either. He had his phone in his jacket pocket and his hands at his sides, and he walked toward her down the corridor with the same economy he always moved with, the same absence of performance. And she watched him come and thought about 40 months of watching from a distance and 14 months of someone else's careful construction and 20 hours of everything since. He stopped 4 feet from her. Marsh, he said. Cooperating, she said. Lane's attorneys retracted the injunction at 9:03. I know. He looked at her. She looked at him. The corridor was very quiet. It's not over, he said. Lane has other instruments, other people. This was the first round, she said. Yes. She held his gaze. Are you going to tell me now that I should step back? That this is your fight and you'll handle the rest? That I should let you manage it from here? He looked at her for a moment. Would you? No, she said. Then I wasn't going to say it. Something moved between them that had the weight and texture of a decision. Not the decision she had made in the cathedral, which had been made from the center of shock and ruin, but something cleaner and more deliberate than that. Something made in a corridor on the 31st floor of a building her grandfather had built, in the full possession of every relevant fact, with her eyes open and her hands steady and her complete attention on the man 4 feet away from her. I need a shower, she said, and 4 hours of sleep. And then I need to sit down with you and my father and the full legal team and build something that Lane can't dismantle in the next round. I have a place, he said. Secure. Your father can come. I know you do, she said. I'm going to need you to understand that accepting that doesn't mean I've stopped asking the questions. I know, he said. You keep saying that. Because it keeps being true, he said. She looked at him for one more moment, then she said, There's something else I need to tell you. His eyes held steady. When I was sitting across from Lane this morning, she said, and he was talking, I wasn't afraid. I've been afraid in rooms before. I know what it feels like. I wasn't afraid. She paused. I was angry, completely, the whole time, and the anger was useful. It was precise. I knew exactly where to put it. He waited, understanding that she wasn't finished. I need to know, she said, whether that's something you did, whether being around you or being in the middle of this situation is what gave me that, or whether it was always mine and the last 16 months just buried it. He looked at her for a long time. It was always yours, he said. I watched you for 14 months before any of this started. The anger was always there. You kept offering people the benefit of the doubt instead of using it. She absorbed this. And now? She asked. Now, he said, you're using it. She nodded. She turned toward her father's office door and she put her hand on the handle, and she felt Alexander standing 4 feet behind her in the corridor with the city spread out below them both, and she felt the full complexity of what was in front of her. The legal architecture still to be built, the third board member's statement, the Lane network still partially intact, the patent portfolio still requiring protection, the company still standing but tested in ways it had not been tested before. And underneath all of it, woven through all of it, the persistent, inconvenient, entirely real question of a man who had spent over a year watching her from a distance and had walked through a door when it mattered. She had 29 hours until Lane's deadline. She had her father on the other side of this door. She had Gerald Marsh's cooperation and Nathan in custody and Richard Holt on a plane he hadn't made it onto. She had a plan and a legal team and the specific hard-edged clarity of someone who had stopped waiting to see how things resolved and had started being the person who resolved them. She opened the door. William Whitmore was sitting at his desk when Evelyn opened the door. Not working, just sitting, with his hands flat on the surface in front of him and his eyes on the window and the particular stillness of a man who had been in the same position long enough that the stillness had become a kind of weather. He turned when she came in. He looked at her face and read it the way he always read it, and whatever he found there made something in his own face release. Not relax, not soften, but release, the way a muscle releases when the load it has been holding is finally set down. Gerald, he said. Cooperating, she said. He'll give them everything. William nodded. He looked down at his hands. I gave that man 16 years. I know. I trusted him with things that... He stopped. His jaw worked. He was at your mother's funeral. I know, Dad. He was quiet for a moment. Outside the window, the city continued its business, indifferent and perpetual, the way it always had. Alexander Sterling is in the corridor, William said. Yes. He looked at her. What are we doing with Alexander Sterling? She sat down in the chair across from his desk. The chair she had sat in since she was small enough that her feet didn't reach the floor. The chair where she had done homework and listened to board meetings she was too young to be in officially, and learned, by proximity and repetition, what it meant to run something that mattered. "I don't know yet," she said. "Completely. But I know what he's done, and I know why he says he did it, and I know what it cost him to do it the way he did it instead of a different way." "What did it cost him?" "He gave the evidence to the government," she said. "He had enough leverage in that material to have approached Lane directly, to have negotiated his own position, to have used us, used the situation, to build something for himself." She paused. "He didn't. He handed it to the U.S. attorney and walked into a cathedral with an envelope and no guarantee about how any of it would land." William looked at her for a long moment. "That could be the long game," he said, "building trust as the mechanism." "It could," she said. "I haven't ruled it out." She held her father's gaze. "But I'm not going to punish him for the possibility of something he hasn't done when what he actually did was exactly what he said it was." William was quiet. He turned back to the window. "Your mother would have had a strong opinion about this," he said. "She would have had 17 strong opinions," Evelyn said, "and she would have been right about most of them." He almost smiled. Almost. "She would have liked him," he said. "She always had a weakness for people who did the right thing badly." Evelyn looked at her father. "What do you mean?" "A man who watches someone for 14 months from a distance because he thinks he'll hurt her," William said. "That's not clean. It's not uncomplicated. It's someone trying to do the right thing with tools that were built for something else." He turned back to her. "Your mother would have recognized that. She would have made him uncomfortable about it for about 45 minutes, and then she would have fed him something and told him to stay." Evelyn felt something move in her chest that she hadn't expected. Not grief exactly, though it had grief's texture. Something closer to the feeling of being handed the specific thing you needed at the moment you needed it, in the form you least anticipated. "Go get some sleep," her father said. 4 hours. "Then come back and we'll build the next thing." She stood. She walked to his desk and put her hand over his, briefly, the way you touch something you didn't want to make a speech about, and then she walked back out into the corridor. Alexander was still there. He had moved to the window at the end of the hall and was looking out at the city with his hands in his pockets, and the particular quality of stillness she was learning to read as his natural register. Not absence of thought, but the opposite of it, a mind running quietly under a surface that had learned not to show the running. He turned when he heard her. 4 hours, she said. "Then we work." He nodded. "You should sleep too," she said. "I will." She looked at him. "The place you mentioned. Secure. How many rooms?" He held her gaze without any performance in it. "As many as needed." "I'll follow in Garrett's car," she said. He nodded again. He didn't say anything else, which she was coming to understand was one of his more reliable qualities. He didn't fill silences with noise. He let them be what they were. They left the building separately, arrived at a townhouse on East 68th Street that had no signage and a door that required 2 forms of identification to open, and they slept in separate rooms on the same floor with 4 inches of wall between them, and those 4 hours were the deepest sleep Evelyn had experienced in longer than she could accurately remember. She woke at 2:14 in the afternoon to 3 texts from Patricia Sue and one from an unknown number that turned out to be Sandra Reyes. She read Reyes's message first. Lane's attorneys filed retraction on all instruments at 12:47 p.m. Marsh deposition complete. Holt signed cooperation agreement 11 a.m. Suggest you call when you're ready to discuss next steps. She sat on the edge of the bed in a borrowed shirt that was 3 sizes too large. She had found it folded on the chair when she woke, left there by someone who had understood she needed something to sleep in and had not made it complicated. And she read the message 3 times. Then she read Patricia's texts. The board had been formally notified. The 2 cooperating members had submitted signed statements. The legal team had filed a protective order around the patent portfolio that would require a full board vote to modify. The voluntary disclosure to the federal investigators had been formally received and acknowledged. The architecture that Lane had spent 3 years building was gone, not damaged, not weakened. Gone. Dismantled at the foundation, the instruments retracted, the intermediaries exposed, the holding account suspended and now subject to federal review. The primary mechanism of the Caldwell marriage dissolved by a federal arraignment that had happened at 8:15 in the morning, while Evelyn was sitting across a table from Victor Lane, watching him try to buy 29 hours he no longer had. She sat with this for a moment. She expected to feel something large. She had been braced for it. The wave of relief or vindication, or the particular physical release of tension held for too long. What she felt instead was quieter and more specific than any of those things. It was the feeling of a door closing, not dramatically, not with force, but with the soft final click of something that had been open too long and was now properly shut. She showered. She dressed in the previous day's charcoal suit, which was the only option. She went downstairs. Alexander was at the kitchen table with coffee and 3 open laptops and a legal pad covered in handwriting she couldn't read from across the room. He looked up when she came in. He took in the suit, the wet hair, the expression on her face that she wasn't trying to manage. "Reyes," she said. "I saw it," he said, 40 minutes ago. She poured coffee from the pot on the counter. Real coffee, dark and serious, the kind that meant someone had been awake for a while, and sat down across from him and wrapped both hands around the mug and looked at the legal pad. "What are you building?" she said. "The next problem," he said. "Lane is retracted but not finished. He still has the political relationships. The financial instruments that weren't directly connected to the Caldwell operation are intact. In 6 months, if we don't build something that makes a second approach more expensive than it's worth, he'll find a different mechanism." "What kind of mechanism?" "Regulatory," Alexander said. "He has 3 connections on the FCC and 2 on the committee that oversees technology export licensing. The patent portfolio, even protected at the board level, can be made unusable if the licensing approval process gets buried in regulatory review for long enough." Evelyn looked at him. "You've been thinking about this since last night." "Since 3 months ago," he said. "This was always the second line of attack. I was hoping we'd have more time before he moved to it." She looked at the legal pad, at the laptops, at the face of a man who had been working this problem continuously for a period of time that most people would find difficult to sustain, and who looked not energized by it, not performing the vitality of someone who thrived on the machinery of conflict, but tired in a way that was honest and that he wasn't trying to hide from her. "How long have you been doing this?" she said. Not the investigation, not the 3 years. She meant the larger thing. The work of existing in the spaces he existed in, with the tools he used, at the cost it clearly extracted. He understood the question. She could see him understand it. "A long time," he said. "Does it—" She stopped. She started again. "Is it what you'd choose? If you were choosing from the beginning?" He looked at her for a moment. He looked down at the legal pad. He picked up the pen and set it down again. A small, abortive gesture that was the most unguarded thing she had seen him do yet. "I built this world because it was the only one that would let me fix certain things," he said. "The tools work. They've always worked. The cost is—" He paused. "The cost is that the tools don't stop being what they are just because the job is finished. They stay with you." She looked at him. "What does that mean for right now?" "It means," he said, "that building something clean from inside something that isn't clean is harder than it looks from the outside, and slower, and I have not always been certain I was doing it right." He held her gaze. "And that is the most honest answer I can give you." She held his gaze back. "All right," she said. "All right," he repeated, not understanding. "That's an honest answer," she said. "That's what I asked for. I'm not going to punish you for giving it to me." Something moved across his face. Slow, unperformed, the specific quality of a man being given something he had not expected and did not entirely know how to hold. They worked through the afternoon. Patricia Sue arrived at 4 with the full legal team, and her father came at 5, and they sat around the large table in Alexander's secure meeting room and built, piece by piece, the architecture of what came next. The patent portfolio protective order, the regulatory preemption strategy, a proactive federal disclosure of the portfolio's national security applications that would make any attempt to bury it in licensing review politically untenable. The board restructuring, which William handled with the precise, unhurried authority of a man who had been running this company for 40 years and was not finished running it. Gerald Marsh resigned at 5:30. His statement, filtered through his attorney, was 4 sentences long and contained no attempt at explanation. Evelyn read it once and set it aside. The 2 cooperating board members made their statements public at 6. By 7, the financial press had the story. Not the version Lane would have written, not the version that centered the Sterling name as threat or the Whitmore family as victim, but the version that Patricia Sue had spent the afternoon carefully shaping. A sophisticated financial conspiracy dismantled through the cooperation of federal investigators and the Whitmore family's proactive disclosure. Alexander's name appeared once, in the 15th paragraph, as a business associate who provided materials relevant to the investigation. No elaboration, no characterization. The kind of sentence that answered the question of his existence in the story without opening a door to the questions that would have come after it. By 8 o'clock, the meeting room had cleared. The legal team left with their files. William stayed an extra 40 minutes to review the board restructuring language, and when he finally stood to leave, he paused at the door and looked at Alexander with the expression of a man who had made a decision he was going to live with. "Sterling," he said. "Mr. Whitmore, my daughter tells me you spent 14 months watching her from a distance because you thought proximity would hurt her." Alexander held the older man's gaze. "Yes. That was either very principled or very cowardly," William said. "I haven't decided which." "It was probably both," Alexander said. William looked at him for a moment. Something shifted in his expression. Not warmth, exactly, but the specific movement of a man who had received an honest answer when he had been prepared for a managed one. "Don't be cowardly again," William said. He left. The room was quiet. Alexander stood at the end of the table and looked at the space where William Whitmore had been standing, and Evelyn sat at the other end with her coffee gone cold in front of her and watched his face. "He's not wrong," she said. "No," Alexander said. She stood. She walked to the window, the one that looked east toward the river, where the city thinned slightly at its edges and you could see the water if you looked for it. She stood there for a moment with her arms crossed and her back to him. "I need to tell you something," she said, "and I need you to just listen. Not respond. Not explain. Just listen." She heard him settle, the slight shift of his weight, the absence of movement that meant attention. "I spent 16 months believing a story someone built specifically for me," she said. "They studied me. They found the exact shape of what I needed to hear, and they said it consistently. And they were patient enough to say it for over a year, and I believed it." She paused. "And I'm not going to stand here and tell you that I've resolved that I'm past it, or over it, or that I know how to trust my own judgment about people again. Because I don't know that yet. It's going to take time, and it's going to be work, and there are going to be days when I look at someone who's being kind to me, and the first thing I feel is suspicion, and I'm going to have to learn to tell the difference between the suspicion that's useful and the suspicion that's just damage." She stopped. The river was there, dark in the evening light, moving the way it always moved. "What I know," she said, "is what I've watched you do. Not what you've told me. What you've done. The government instead of leverage. The cathedral instead of a phone call. The honest answer this afternoon when I asked you a question you didn't have to answer honestly." She turned around. He was watching her with the steady, unguarded attention she had come to rely on without realizing she had come to rely on it. "I'm not going to pretend that's enough to build something on. Not yet. But I'm also not going to pretend it's nothing." He looked at her for a long time. "I'm not asking you to pretend anything," he said. "I know. And I'm not going to tell you to hurry," he said. The words came with a slight roughness, like a man choosing language carefully from a vocabulary he didn't use often. "Whatever time this takes, whatever you need to trust what you're seeing again, I'm not going to rush it." She looked at him. "You've been patient before." "That was distance," he said. "That was easy." Something shifted in his face, slight and honest. "This is harder." She felt the truth of that. She felt it in the specific physical way that certain true things landed, not in the mind, but somewhere more central, somewhere that didn't ask for verification. "I know," she said. 3 weeks later, on a Thursday morning in October, Evelyn Whitmore walked into a federal courthouse on Pearl Street and sat in the gallery for the formal arraignment of Nathan Caldwell on 14 counts of securities fraud and financial conspiracy. The bail denial had held. He came in through the side door in a suit that had been pressed but that no longer fit him correctly. He had lost weight in the 3 weeks since the cathedral, the specific kind of weight that came not from intention but from the body's response to sustained stress. And he stood at the defense table and looked straight ahead. He did not look at the gallery. She wasn't sure whether that was deliberate or whether he simply didn't know she was there. She sat in the third row with Patricia Sue beside her and watched the proceeding with the complete attention she brought to everything now. The sharper, less forgiving attention of someone who had learned that the most dangerous lies were the ones that looked like stories you already wanted to believe. The arraignment took 11 minutes. Nathan entered a not guilty plea in a voice that was controlled and professional and utterly without the quality that had made him believable, the warmth, the intimacy, the sense that you were being spoken to by someone who meant it. Without that quality, the voice was just a voice, a competent instrument in the service of nothing particular. She left before it was finished. She had heard what she needed to hear. Madison Harper had left New York 2 weeks earlier. Evelyn knew this not because she was tracking it, but because Madison's mother, a woman named Carol, who had sent Evelyn birthday cards for 30 years and who had nothing to do with what her daughter had done, had called to apologize. The call had lasted 4 minutes. Evelyn had listened to every word of it and had said, at the end, "Carol, you don't carry this. This isn't yours." There had been a long silence on the line, and then Carol Harper had said thank you in a voice that was barely audible. And Evelyn had meant what she said, completely, and had hung up and sat for a few minutes with the specific, complicated grief of a friendship that had been real for long enough that its falseness at the end couldn't retroactively erase all of it, and that understanding was its own kind of loss, separate from the betrayal, requiring its own separate time. She gave it the time it required. She did not rush it. Victor Lane did not disappear. She had known he wouldn't. Alexander had been clear about that, and she had believed him. What happened instead was slower and less dramatic than a confrontation. The regulatory connections he had built became less useful as the preemptive federal disclosure of the patent portfolio's security applications moved through the appropriate channels. One FCC contact resigned in November in connection with a separate investigation that had nothing to do with Lane and everything to do with the particular vulnerability of people who had spent years doing favors they assumed would never be examined. A second contact, when approached informally through channels Evelyn declined to ask too many questions about, communicated that he would not be available for the kind of work Lane required going forward. Lane himself made no further moves against Whitmore Technologies, whether this was because the cost had become prohibitive, or because Alexander had communicated something to him through means Evelyn was not made fully aware of, or because he was occupied with other problems generated by the federal investigation's expansion into his network, she was not entirely certain. She accepted the uncertainty. Some things were not going to be fully legible to her, and part of what she was learning, slowly, with effort, was the difference between the uncertainty she could resolve through more information and the uncertainty that was simply the cost of operating in a world more complicated than the one she had previously allowed herself to inhabit. Richard Holt's cooperation agreement resulted in a sentencing recommendation that his attorneys called generous and that the federal investigators described as appropriate to the level of assistance provided. He pled guilty in December to 2 counts of financial fraud. He did not request to speak to Evelyn before or after. She did not request to speak to him. There was nothing either of them needed from the other that the legal process hadn't already extracted. The Whitmore board was restructured in November. 3 new members were seated, selected through a process that Evelyn personally oversaw, and that included, for the first time in the company's history, an independent ethics review of every candidate. Her father was present for the seating. He sat at the head of the table and watched it happen and said, afterward, walking to the elevator with Evelyn, "Your grandfather would have done this 50 years ago if someone had pushed him." She had said, "I'm pushing now." And her father had looked at her with an expression she had been seeing more of in the months since the cathedral, something that was not just pride, but its more complex relation, the specific regard of someone who had watched a person become themselves. The patent portfolio's federal security application was formally acknowledged in January. The protective designation made any third-party licensing attempt subject to a level of governmental review that rendered the kind of regulatory manipulation Lane had planned effectively impossible. The 11 years of work her family's company had built was, for the first time, properly protected. She told Alexander about the designation on a Saturday morning in his kitchen, where she had taken to arriving at 9 o'clock with a bag from the bakery on Lexington that made the specific kind of almond croissant she had liked since she was 12. She had been doing this for 6 weeks. It had not been discussed or negotiated. It had simply become the shape of Saturday mornings, the way certain things became shapes without either party deciding to make them shapes. He was reading something at the table when she came in. He looked up. She set the bag down and said, "The patent designation came through," and he set the document down and looked at her with the expression that had replaced, over the months, the careful containment of the early weeks. Something more open, less managed. The face of a man who had stopped allocating as much effort to not being readable. "How do you feel?" he said. She thought about it. She poured coffee. She sat down across from him and put the croissant in front of him without being asked, because he forgot to eat in the mornings and she had stopped pretending she hadn't noticed. "Relieved," she said, "and a little angry that it took this long, and aware that both of those things are going to coexist for a while." "That sounds right," he said. "I know it sounds right," she said. "I'm getting better at knowing when things sound right." He looked at her. Something in his expression moved. The slow, unperformed movement she had catalogued over months. The specific quality of a man allowing himself to feel something without immediately converting it into information. "What?" she said. "Nothing," he said. "Alexander." He looked down at the croissant. He picked it up. He set it down. He looked back at her with an expression she had not seen before. Not any of the others, not the steadiness of the cathedral or the containment of the car or the honesty of the kitchen 3 months ago. Something underneath all of those, something that had been under all of them, she understood now, the whole time. "I want to ask you something," he said. "Ask it." "The Saturday mornings," he said. She waited. "I need to know," he said, "whether you're here because it's become a habit or—" He stopped. He started again, and she understood that this was costing him something, the asking, that a man who had built his life on not needing to ask was navigating the specific discomfort of needing to ask. "I need to know what this is." She looked at him for a moment. "You told me 4 months ago that you weren't going to rush me," she said. "I know." "And you haven't," she said. "You've been—" She looked for the right word. Not patient. That was too passive for what he had actually done, which was more active than patience, more deliberate. "You've been present," she said, "without making it into something I had to manage." "I know," he said again. "That's not nothing," she said. "That's not a habit. That's a choice I make every Saturday." She held his gaze. "I know the difference between a habit and a choice. I spent 16 months mistaking one for the other. I don't do that anymore." He was still for a moment. Then he nodded. A single, slight movement that carried more weight than most conversations she had had in the previous year. "All right," he said. "All right," she said. She picked up her coffee. He picked up his croissant. Outside the window, the city was doing what it always did. Moving, indifferent, perpetual. And the kitchen was warm and quiet and smelled like almond and coffee and the particular smell of a morning that didn't have anywhere it needed to be yet. They sat in the kitchen for 2 hours that morning, which was longer than either of them usually stayed before the day's work started. They talked about the company restructuring and a board presentation she was building and a regulatory question his legal team had raised, and then, later, they talked about other things. A book he had been trying to finish for 6 months and couldn't locate the time for. A neighborhood in Brooklyn she had been walking through on Sunday evenings when she needed to move without destination, the specific quality of light in October that she had always loved and that had been complicated this October by everything October had contained. He listened the way he always listened, fully, without allocation, without the performing of listening that she had learned to identify as its counterfeit. She talked the way she was learning to talk, Without the managed quality that had governed most of her communications for the last year of her life, the constant self-editing of someone who had learned that being known was dangerous. She was unlearning that. It was slow work. It required, some days, a conscious decision she had to remake from the ground up. She was making it. In March, 6 months after the cathedral, Whitmore Technologies announced a strategic partnership with Sterling Holdings. The announcement was covered by the financial press as a business development story. A technology company and a holdings firm finding aligned interests in the infrastructure sector. The personal dimensions of it were not part of the announcement because they were not the public's business and because Evelyn had spent enough of her private life in public for 1 year. Her father attended the press conference. He stood at the back of the room and watched Evelyn field questions from financial journalists with the specific fluency of someone who had been doing this her entire professional life and was now doing it from a different position. Not the position of William Whitmore's daughter managing his company while he managed his health, but from her own position, which was distinct and grounded and entirely hers. Afterward, in the car, William said, "Your mother would have had something to say about how you handled the third question. She would have told me I was too direct." "She would have told you that you were exactly direct enough," William said, "and then given you a look that suggested she meant too direct." Evelyn felt the grief move through her the way it did now. Cleanly, without the complicated layering of the earlier months, the grief that had been mixed with the weight of the cathedral and the betrayal and the exhaustion. Just grief now, specific and honest, for a woman who was not here to see this particular morning. "I know," she said. She was in her office at 6 o'clock that evening, working through the partnership documentation, when Alexander appeared in the doorway. He had been at the press conference. He had stood at the side of the room the way he stood in most rooms, present, unperforming, taking up exactly the space he occupied and no more. He had caught her eye once, when the third question had been asked, and the look had contained something brief and specific that had nothing to do with the question. Now he stood in the doorway with his jacket over his arm and said, "You didn't eat." "I know. It's 6 o'clock. I'm aware of what time it is." He set his jacket over the chair and sat down across from her desk. The same chair her father sat in, the same chair she had sat in across from her father's desk when she was small enough that her feet didn't reach the floor. And he looked at her with the steady, unguarded attention that was simply his face now, as far as she was concerned, the face she saw when she thought of him, which was more often than she had admitted to anyone, including herself. "Tell me about the documentation," he said. She told him. He listened. He asked 3 questions, all of them relevant, none of them performative. She answered them, and then they talked about the regulatory calendar and the board's spring schedule, and a personnel matter in her legal team that needed addressing. At 7:30, she closed the laptop. She sat back in her chair and looked at him across the desk. This man, in this office, in this specific configuration of the world that had been built out of the wreckage of a morning in October that she would spend the rest of her life carrying in some form, because some things didn't stop being carried, they just changed what they weighed. "I want to say something," she said. He waited. "I'm not the person who walked into that cathedral," she said. "I know that. I'm not the person who sat at that vanity at 5 in the morning looking at herself in the mirror and asking whether she was going to be believed." She paused. "I don't know yet who I am, completely. That's still in process." She held his gaze. "But I know I'm not afraid of the process anymore. And I know that's not nothing. And I know part of why it's not nothing is what happened in the last 6 months, and I know part of that is you." He looked at her with the expression she had been cataloging for months and had finally, in the last few weeks, stopped trying to name and had simply accepted as the expression a person had when they were looking at something they had decided to remain near. "I'm not going anywhere," he said. "I know," she said. "I mean that differently than other people have meant it," he said. "I know that too," she said. He nodded. He stood. He picked up his jacket. He looked at her one more time with that expression, open, steady, costly, in the specific way that honest things were costly when you had spent a long time not offering them. "Dinner," he said. "Yes," she said. She stood. She turned off the desk lamp. The office went dark except for the city light coming through the windows, the orange-gray permanence of it, the same light that had been there the night of the board meeting and the morning of the arraignment and the Saturday mornings in the kitchen and all the days between. She picked up her bag. She walked around the desk. She crossed the office to where he was standing near the door, and she stopped beside him, and she looked up at him in the dark office with the city behind him and the 6 months between the cathedral and this moment arranged in her mind, not as a wound or a story or a lesson, but as the specific and irreducible fact of what had actually happened, the complete, unedited truth of it, every piece. She reached out and took his hand. His fingers closed around hers with the quiet certainty of something that had made its decision long ago and had been waiting, with the particular patience of things that knew how to wait, for the moment when the decision could finally be held in the open. They walked out of the office together, and the door closed behind them, and the city went on doing what it always did, indifferent and relentless and full of the next thing, the way it had been her entire life, the way it would be long after her. But she was not indifferent to it anymore. She was not waiting to see how things resolved. She was the person who walked toward the next thing with her eyes open and her hands steady, and the full hard-won knowledge of what she was worth, not as a number, not as an asset, not as a body or a name or a seat at a table someone else had built, but as herself completely, exactly as she was. That knowledge had cost her everything she thought she had. It had given her everything she actually needed. And she carried it forward into the ordinary, irreplaceable fact of the evening, into dinner and the walk after, and the city doing its city work around them. Without apology, without armor, without the old habit of making herself smaller,